the story of Rome can hardly be separated from the story of Italy itself. From the earliest days, the ambitions of the city were tied to the fate of the peninsula that surrounded it. Rome first sought to dominate the neighbouring peoples of Italy, then relied on their strength to defend itself and to expand beyond its borders. Over time, the city absorbed the land so completely that Italy seemed to disappear inside Rome. Yet at the same time, the peninsula became the foundation of an empire that stretched across the known world. Even when Roman power reached far beyond the Mediterranean, the heart of that power remained Italian in spirit and direction. In the beginning, Rome was simply another city-state, much like Athens or the proud republics of medieval Europe. It possessed its own laws, customs, and limited territory. Centuries later, it had become something entirely different, an imperial authority that gave its name and order to distant provinces. Yet whether in the age of early heroes or under the rule of emperors, Rome never ceased to think of itself as the leader of Italy. The long contest between Eastern and Western influences, symbolized by the struggle of rival generals at the end of the Republic, reflected a tension that had shaped Roman history from the start. To understand why Rome rose as it did, one must look beyond battles and rulers to the land itself. Geography influenced what the Romans feared, what they desired, and how they fought. The shape of Italy, its mountains and rivers, and its position in the middle of the Mediterranean all helped to determine the character of its people. Rome's great achievement was twofold. First, to unite the many Italian communities under a single authority, and then to use that united strength to bring stability to a wider world that had long been torn by conflict. Italy lies like a bridge between East and West. The peninsula extends deep into the southern sea, flanked by islands that seem like natural extensions of its shores. Protected in part by the Arc of the Alps and by the broad valley of the Po, Italy enjoyed a measure of security from northern invasions, yet those barriers were never complete. At the same time, its central position allowed it to influence both the Greek world to the east and the lands of Spain and Africa to the west. Sicily, almost touching the Italian toe, became a meeting place of cultures and a prize fought over by many peoples. The land itself stands between extremes. Greece is broken into countless fragments by mountains and inlets, while Spain forms a single massive plateau. Italy, by contrast, remains one connected whole, shaped by the long spine of the Apennines. These mountains begin near the Ligurian coast and run down the length of the peninsula, giving Italy its familiar outline. On the eastern side, the slopes fall steeply toward the Adriatic, leaving little room for broad harbours or fertile plains. The western side is gentler, opening into valleys and natural ports that encourage trade and contact with other nations. For this reason, Italian civilization developed more strongly toward the west than toward the east. The Apennines did more than shape the coastline. They shaped the people. Unlike the mountains of Greece, which isolated communities from one another, the Italian range offered passes and upland pastures that connected highland and lowland. Shepherds moved their flocks between summer and winter grounds, and traders followed the same paths. Conflicts certainly arose between the rugged hill dwellers and the richer farmers of the plains. But in the end, the geography encouraged cooperation, rather than permanent division. Rome eventually mastered both regions and turned their rivalry into unity. Volcanic forces also left their mark. The fertile soils of Campania, the lakes scattered across central Italy, and even the building materials of Rome itself were gifts of ancient eruptions. The landscape was beautiful, but also dangerous, reminding its inhabitants that the earth beneath them was alive. Italy's rivers played a quieter role than those of some other lands, yet they too influenced history. The greatest of them, the Po, flows through the northern plain like a vast artery, fed by streams descending from the Alps and the Apennines. For centuries, this region lay outside Roman control, and only gradually did Roman power push northward to claim it. The Po Valley was extraordinarily productive, though plagued by floods and marshes that required constant labour to control. Towns did not rise along its banks as they did beside the Rhine or the Rhone, but the river served as a highway for commerce and communication. South of the Apennines, the rivers are smaller and more variable. The Arno winds through the Tuscan hills toward the Western Sea, while the Tiber, destined to become the river of Rome, gathers its waters from the heart of the peninsula. In early times, ships could sail far up its course, bringing grain and timber to the growing city. Yet the same river that nourished Rome also threatened it with frequent floods, forcing the Romans to become masters of engineering and regulation. Other streams marked the boundaries of ancient struggles. The Liris guarded the southern approaches to Latium. The Volturnus opened a route between the Samnite mountains and the Campanian plain, and the Aufidus crossed the fields where one of Rome's greatest defeats occurred. Even small rivers became witnesses to turning points in Italian history. Italy's lakes reveal another contrast between north and south. The deep northern waters, set among the Alps, resemble inland seas and have long been celebrated for their beauty. The lakes of central Italy are different, many of them lying in the craters of extinct volcanoes or in shallow basins without outlets. These tranquil surfaces conceal complex geological stories and once provided natural defences for nearby towns. Climate added further variety. The Po Valley experiences cold winters and generous summer rains, conditions more like Central Europe than the Mediterranean. The southern coasts enjoy mild seasons and a warmth that nourished olives, grapes, and citrus fruits. Between these zones stretches the true heart of Italy, where vine and olive grow on the lower slopes and forests once covered the higher ridges. Over centuries, war, neglect, and the spread of large estates stripped many hills of their trees. Yet in ancient days the land was richer and more welcoming. All these features combined to shape the destiny of Rome. The peninsula offered enough protection to allow a strong people to grow. Yet, it was open enough to invite contact with the wider world. Italy faced westward, and so did Roman ambition. From this base, Rome first united its neighbours, then looked beyond the sea to Spain, Africa, and Greece. The city that began as a modest community beside the Tiber became the centre of a civilization because the land around it encouraged both discipline and expansion. In the end, the geography of Italy explains much of Rome's character. The mountains taught endurance, the plains rewarded organisation, and the seas invited adventure. The Romans learned to command roads across difficult terrain, to drain marshes, to bridge rivers, and to bind diverse peoples into a single state. Their achievements were not inevitable, yet the shape of the peninsula offered opportunities that few other lands could match. Italy's landscape created more than dramatic coastlines and mountain passes. It also produced a remarkable range of food and raw materials. Because the climates of the peninsula shift so sharply from north to south and from plain to highland. Some items that feel typical today arrived much later, brought in from other parts of the world and gradually made at home in Italian soil. Even so, the core agricultural trio that shaped daily life for centuries was already firmly established early on: grain, olives, and vines. These were the dependable foundations of farming, diet, trade, and wealth long before Italy became the centre of an empire. Olive oil, in particular, became a defining product. Across the Mediterranean, it was used for cooking, lighting, and rituals. Italy developed a reputation for producing it in great quantity and consistent quality. Wine followed the same pattern. Certain districts became famous for strong, celebrated vintages, prized by the wealthy and copied by rivals. Yet agriculture was never just a romantic picture of hillsides and harvests. It was also politics. Roman leaders did not simply allow the market to decide what would be planted. Policies protected some producers and restricted others. Over time, however, grain farming struggled to compete with cheap imports. As profits shifted, many landowners found it more attractive to turn fields into pasture for sheep or into intensive gardens aimed at urban buyers. Those changes did not happen in a calm and balanced way. They were amplified by harsh laws, unequal ownership, and an economic system that relied heavily on enslaved labour. The result was a countryside that could grow rich in certain hands, while becoming weaker and emptier in others. Manufacturing never became Italy's greatest strength in the way it did in some later industrial societies. There were crafts and workshops, and textiles in particular could be produced on a large scale. But the peninsula remained, at its core, a land built around farming and landholding. As local field industries declined and luxury consumption rose, Italy's trade balance tended to tilt in an unhealthy direction. Large sums flowed outward to pay for food supplies, artwork, and expensive goods brought from the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Money returned, but not in the form of stable productivity. It often came back through imperial extraction, taxes, forced payments, interest squeezed from provinces, and the profits of officials who treated distant regions as opportunities for private gain. This circulation could make the centre glitter, but it also carried long-term risks for the stability of the land that supported the whole system. For all its natural advantages, Italy faced a quiet enemy that could ruin even the richest ground. In many low-lying areas, stagnant water and warm air produced a dangerous fever that turned fertile districts into places people feared to inhabit. Wide western plains, stretches of the southern coast, and the edges of islands were especially vulnerable. Some regions that once held busy towns, roads crowded with travellers, and landscapes marked by towers and temples later became silent, thinly populated, and difficult to cultivate. The problem did not appear overnight. It worsened in different periods, expanding across broader tracts in the medieval and modern eras. Yet the land itself offered a clue to a solution. Where drainage improved, where cultivation returned, and where settlement became steady again, the threat often retreated. In places abandoned for generations, the return of the plough could slowly push back the unhealthy air. This natural setting helps explain why the peninsula became such a crossroads of peoples. Italy was not filled by one single tribe that spread evenly across a unified land. It was shaped by repeated arrivals. Pressure from the north and east drove migrating groups toward the Alps, and once those passes were crossed, newcomers could flow into the plains and valleys. Meanwhile, the long coastline, broken by many landing points, invited sailors and settlers from across the sea. Italy was more geographically coherent than Greece, yet its mountain ridges still divided the interior into pockets, allowing separate communities to form, survive, and develop distinct identities. The result was a patchwork of cultures, languages, and political habits that existed side by side. In the far northwest, along the rugged slopes and the coast near the Gulf of Genoa, lived peoples accustomed to hard terrain. They were pushed back again and again by stronger arrivals, retreating into mountain country where survival depended on hunting, raiding, and knowledge of the passes. Their resistance to invaders was stubborn and exhausting, and when Rome eventually absorbed the region, it found that these highland fighters could become useful as mobile troops suited to rough ground. Across the wide northern plain, another group arrived in waves from beyond the mountains. These settlers gave their name to the region and left a long memory of fear behind them. Their style of warfare depended on speed, sudden assault, and the confidence of large war bands. Rome, like earlier Mediterranean societies, came to treat the northern warrior as a symbol of the outsider, fierce and unpredictable. The shock of invasion became a force in itself, pushing the Italian communities to rally behind the strongest state for protection. In time, the northern plains were not only conquered but transformed into one of the most prosperous zones of Italy, tied ever more closely to Roman life as roads, colonies, and administration advanced toward the Alps. Near the head of the Adriatic, another population held its ground against pressure from the west and north. Their position made them natural intermediaries between the peninsula and the lands across the sea. Contact with traders and nearby colonies encouraged earlier adoption of Mediterranean habits, and later, political alignment with Rome offered security against more aggressive neighbours. Beyond the central mountains, in the region later known as Etruria, lived a people who remain among the most debated in Italian history. Their language and customs did not fit neatly into the categories surrounding them, and they were viewed by Romans as distinct and foreign. In earlier centuries, they had dominated broad spaces, even holding strong points in the north and reaching into the south. They built fortified hill towns with massive walls and complex engineering works that still suggest wealth, planning, and organization. For a time, their power extended into Campania, and a ruling line from their world even touched Rome. Yet their strength was uneven. Their cities formed loose leagues, rather than a single unified state, and cooperation in war was limited. They were capable at sea for a period, controlling waters and clashing with rivals over islands and trade routes. But defeats at key moments weakened their naval reach. Pressure then came from multiple sides: northern raiders, southern rivals, and the rising force of Rome. Internal tensions, inequality, and a taste for luxury in elite life could sap collective resilience. Over time, the once formidable network gave ground, and the region fell into Rome's orbit. Even in defeat, their influence did not vanish. Elements of ritual, art, architecture, and public spectacle in Roman life carried traces of this older world. Alongside these peoples were the groups considered most fully Italian in language and tradition, though even they were divided into branches spread across the peninsula. In the north-central interior lived communities often described as very ancient in the land. Their many small settlements made coordinated defence difficult, and in the struggle against stronger neighbours, they sometimes accepted Roman dominance as the price of survival and revenge. Rome's roads and forts later bound their territory tightly to the new order, turning their valleys into corridors of Roman movement. East of the Tiber, in rugged country of hills and narrow valleys, lived tribes famed in later memory for austere habits and strict values. From such highland communities came repeated movements southward over the centuries as younger generations sought new land. These migrations created related groups across central and southern Italy, many of them organized less as centralized states and more as confederations of clans and cantons. Their mountain environment protected them, but it also encouraged village life over large urban centers. Seasonal movement of herds between lowland and upland pastures became part of the rhythm of life. In war, these peoples could be fierce and persistent. In the great contest between Roman expansion and the independence of the highlands, some allied with Rome early, others fought bitterly, and the last major resistance drew its strength above all from the southern highland nations. Southeast of the Roman heartland, other tribes occupied strategic ridges and valleys. Some became lasting allies of Rome because their own survival depended on resisting more aggressive neighbours. Others controlled stretches of coastline and marshy lowlands and were early enemies of Rome, pressing close to the Latin plain before being driven back by shifting coalitions and the growing power of the city. In the lowlands nearest Rome lived the Latin communities, bound together by shared language, shared rituals, and a sense of kinship. Their towns formed a network across the plain and the volcanic hills. Religious gatherings and seasonal festivals reinforced unity, and regular meetings encouraged arbitration and common policy. Leadership within the Latin world was not absolute at first. The communities kept their independence, but the habit of acting together made the group stronger than a collection of isolated towns. In time, Rome rose from within this environment, first as a leading city, and later as the dominant power. Further south, broad regions were held by peoples linked by related languages and customs, yet shaped by very different circumstances. Highland confederations produced tough fighters who could raid down into fertile plains, seizing land and building influence. But their political structures were not designed for sustained expansion on the Roman model. They could fight stubbornly, even heroically, yet they lacked a single permanent capital that could coordinate strategy across generations. When Rome met them in long war, it was not only armies against armies. It was an organized urban state against a world of mountain communities, village loyalties, and shifting coalitions. The outcome was decided as much by diplomacy, logistics, and persistence as by battlefield bravery. In the heel and spur of Italy, other clans had arrived by sea from across the Adriatic in earlier ages. Their ties with the opposite coast helped explain their readiness to adopt writing and cultural habits from the Greek world. They resisted domination for centuries, then found themselves caught between larger forces and eventually welcomed Rome's intervention when pressure from the interior grew too dangerous. Along the southern coasts, Greek settlements spread so widely that the region took on a Greek identity in language and city life. Some of these cities were early gateways through which Greek culture reached Italy. Others became major commercial centres, with strong fleets, skilled crafts, and international connections. Their presence affected the balance of power in Italy. In certain wars, their harbours supplied sailors and ships to Rome. In others, their leaders resisted Roman expansion and drew Rome deeper into southern politics. Even when many Greek cities declined or lost independence, Greek speech and customs remained in parts of Italy and the nearby islands for a very long time. No island mattered more to the story than Sicily. It was close enough to feel Italian, yet large and strategically placed, enough to shape the fate of the whole Mediterranean. Its position between east and west made it both a bridge and a battleground. Harbours lined much of its coast, and fertile plains supported heavy grain production and horse breeding. Settlers from the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa competed for influence, while native populations absorbed foreign language and habits, until local identity became deeply blended. Control of Sicily meant control of a key route, and conflicts there became clashes between entire worlds. When Rome finally gained dominance, it did not simply win an island, it secured a platform that would pull it into wider struggles and turn it from an Italian power into a Mediterranean one. Other islands followed different paths. Some remained less developed for long periods, not because the land had nothing to offer, but because outside powers treated them as closed possessions. Under Rome, they could become useful suppliers of grain, timber, and other resources, though their unhealthy lowlands also carried the same fever risks seen on parts of the Italian mainland. Against this background of varied lands and competing peoples, Rome's rise becomes easier to understand. The city was not crushed early by a single overwhelming foreign empire. Sea powers focused on trade and rivals elsewhere. Greek attention was often drawn eastward. older regional powers weakened at the very moment Rome was growing. Raids from the north frightened Italy, but also encouraged unity around the strongest defender. Rome also possessed internal strengths: a disciplined army system, political endurance, and a habit of adapting strategy to circumstance. Geography gave Rome another advantage. The city stood near the centre of the peninsula, on the most useful river in central Italy. Its hills offered a defensible position, yet it lay close enough to the sea to profit from commerce while being far enough inland to reduce vulnerability to sudden coastal attack. That placement made Rome a natural marketplace for surrounding regions and a logical leader within the Latin plain. As it expanded, its central position allowed it to move forces along shorter routes, isolate enemies from one another, and strike with concentrated strength. Step by step, Rome turned the fragmented map of Italy into a single political space. Once Italy was secured, new responsibilities followed. Defense could no longer stop at the walls of the city or the borders of the Latin plain. Control of nearby seas, islands, and coastal approaches became essential. Conflict with established maritime powers was difficult to avoid. An expansion to the Alpine frontier became the practical solution to repeated pressure from the north. What began as a local struggle for survival and supremacy inside Italy widened into a long series of wars that reshaped the Mediterranean world. Rome's ascent, in that sense, was not a sudden leap, but the steady outcome of geography, demography, strategy, and time, all working together until the city became the centre of a much larger order. Retelling Rome's earliest beginnings is always a strange task. The accounts are wrapped in myth, shaped by storytellers, polished by generations, and repeated so often that they began to feel like memory. Many of the figures stand half in shadow, and many deeds described in these tales do not behave like strict history. Yet the legends mattered. They became part of how Romans understood themselves, how they explained their city's character, and how they justified its claims about destiny and rule. Even when the facts cannot be proven, the stories still reveal what people wanted to believe about Rome's birth, and the kind of power it was meant to become. The traditional story begins far away with the fall of Troy. A survivor named Aeneas escapes the burning city, carrying his father and protecting the sacred symbols of his household. After long wandering across sea and shore, he reaches the western land that fate has marked as his future home. There, he is received by King Latinus, who offers friendship and intends to bind the stranger's line to his own by marriage with his daughter Lavinia. But peace does not last. Conflict breaks out between newcomers and locals, and the early settlement is drawn into war. Latinus dies, the original city falls, and the struggle ends only when Aeneas takes Lavinia as his wife and founds a new place that carries her name. In this version of the past, two peoples become one, and the name Latin is explained as a living inheritance from the old king. The tale does not stop there. Another enemy rises in the figure of Turnus, who allies himself with an Etruscan ruler and meets Aeneas in battle near a river. Turnus is killed, and Aeneas himself vanishes from the human world, leaving behind a memory that is more than mortal. The story says he is honoured as a divine protector, as if the first root of Rome must be touched by the gods. His son, Ascanius, also remembered by another name, takes leadership and carries the line forward. He defeats the remaining foe and establishes a new city on a high ridge, Alba Longa, which becomes the cradle of a dynasty. The kings of Alba rule for many generations, and time is stretched across centuries as if to create a long bridge between heroic origins and the founding of Rome. When the appointed moment arrives, Alba is ruled by Numitor, who is overthrown by his younger brother, Amulius. The usurper secures his throne by removing rivals with ruthless efficiency. Numitor's sons are killed, and his daughter, Rhea Silvia, is forced into a sacred role that demands lifelong virginity. The point is clear. If she cannot marry, she cannot produce heirs. But the legend insists that power can never fully control fate. Rhea Silvia becomes pregnant, and the children are said to be fathered by Mars himself. Alarmed, Amulius orders the twins destroyed by drowning them in the Tiber. Nature intervenes. The river has flooded, and instead of sinking, the basket carrying the infants drifts to the edge of the Palatine Hill and comes to rest near a sacred tree. There, the story introduces its most famous image. A she-wolf discovers the crying newborns and nurses them in a cave. A royal herdsman later finds the twins, raises them in secret, and gives them the names Romulus and Remus. They grow up not as princes in a palace, but as hardy young men shaped by the rough life of shepherds, used to quarrels, raids, and the sharp justice of the countryside. As adults, their hidden identity is revealed through conflict. A dispute among herdsmen escalates, and the chain of events leads to the discovery that the twins are of royal blood. They confront Amulius, kill him, and restore their grandfather Numitor to the throne of Alba. Yet they do not remain there. The legend insists they are drawn back to the place where the river spared them. They decide to build a new city beside the Tiber, but even the founding becomes a test of rivalry. The question of who will rule the future city is taken to the heavens, judged by signs in the sky. Remus claims the first omen. Romulus claims the greater one, and the dispute ends with Romulus beginning the walls on the Palatine. Remus mocks the fragile boundary by leaping it, and Romulus kills his brother to make the warning unforgettable. The city is named Rome, and its first line is drawn in blood, as though to explain the harshness that Romans later believed was necessary to maintain order. Now, the new settlement faces a practical problem. It is full of men, but it lacks women. To solve this, Romulus declares a sanctuary that attracts fugitives, exiles, and desperate outsiders. Rome becomes a magnet for the displaced, a city built from those who have nowhere else to go. Then, through a planned festival that appears friendly on the surface, the Romans seize women from neighbouring communities, most famously the Sabines. The outrage sparks war. Battles follow. Raids are answered by counterattacks, and Romulus is portrayed as a warrior king who wins prestige by defeating local rulers and dedicating captured armour as a sacred trophy. The Sabines eventually appear in force under their own king, establishing a position close to Rome and even taking the citadel through betrayal. The story gives betrayal a face in the figure of Tarpeia, a young woman who opens the gate, in exchange for what she believes will be valuable prizes. Instead, she is crushed to death beneath the weight of shields, and the myth turns her name into a permanent symbol of treason. Fighting then erupts in the valley between Rome's hills, and for a moment the Romans are driven back toward their own gates. Romulus calls on a divine protector to halt the panic, and the legend says the flight stops. Yet the battle's real end comes not from strength, but from a human intervention. The abducted women, now wives and mothers within Rome, rush between both armies and force their fathers and husbands to lay down arms. The two peoples merge. For a time, two kings rule together, a sign that early Rome is imagined not as pure conquest, but as forced integration. When the Sabine king dies, Romulus rules alone. He becomes not only a fighter, but a lawgiver. The population is organised into tribes and smaller voting groups, and the army is given a structured form with infantry and cavalry. The Council of Elders is established as an advisory body, drawn from leading families. The household itself is described as a miniature state, ruled by the father with sweeping authority, while dependents are tied to patrons through mutual obligation. The legend here is not trying to offer modern morality. It is trying to explain a social order that Romans later considered ancient and foundational. After a long reign, Romulus disappears during a storm while addressing an assembly. The people search for him, but he is gone. Soon, a respected figure claims to have seen Romulus afterward, no longer human, promising that Rome will one day command the world. The vanished king is then honoured as a god of the spear-bearing community, transformed from founder into divine guardian. The message is clear. Rome's beginning is presented as something protected and guided from above. With Romulus gone, the senators refuse to choose a new king immediately, and authority shifts uneasily among the elite. Social tension grows, especially between Romans and the Sabine element now inside the city. Eventually, a compromise is reached. A Sabine is chosen as king, a man presented as devout and thoughtful rather than martial. This is Numa, whose reign is remembered as a deliberate counterweight to the violence of the founding. Instead of conquest, his focus is order, ritual, and the discipline of religion. He is said to receive instruction from a divine companion in a sacred grove, and under his guidance, Rome's priesthoods, rites, and sacred offices take shape. Ritual specialists are organized, public ceremonies are formalized, and the protection of the city's sacred fire becomes a central duty. Land is measured and boundaries are treated as holy, with curses laid on anyone who moves a marker. Craftsmen are grouped by trade, and civic trust is elevated into something almost sacred. Under Numa, the story claims, war ceases and peace is signalled by closed gates, as if the city is learning to restrain itself. Then, the narrative swings again, as a new king appears who embodies aggression and pride. Tullus is remembered as a man of war. A conflict with Alba reignites the old connection between Rome and its legendary mother city. The dispute begins at the border and turns into formal hostility. Instead of a full battle, champions are chosen. 3 brothers for Rome and 3 for Alba. The duel becomes a spectacle of courage and strategy. 2 Romans fall, leaving 1 survivor against 3 wounded opponents. By feigning retreat and breaking their formation, he kills them one by one and wins the contest for Rome. Victory, however, is followed by a darker scene. The hero returns carrying the spoils of the slain, and his sister recognizes the cloak of her promised husband among them. Her grief is treated not as private sorrow, but as betrayal, and the brother kills her in rage. He is sentenced, then spared after appealing to the people, who value his service to the city above strict justice. The legend uses this episode to illustrate a brutal principle. Loyalty to Rome is placed above family. Alba is not destroyed immediately, but its leader proves unreliable. When Rome fights other enemies, the Alban commander hesitates, waiting to side with whoever wins. After Rome prevails, Tullus punishes the betrayal with a terrifying execution, then orders Alba dismantled. Its people are moved into Rome, increasing the city's population and strengthening it with forced incorporation. Yet the same king who expands Rome is also shown as neglecting the gods. In the end, the story says he is struck down by divine lightning, consumed along with his house. The moral is blunt. Strength without reverence invites ruin. The next ruler, Ancus, is presented as a return to balance. He revives sacred customs, but he does not hesitate to fight when Rome's lands are attacked. He conquers neighbouring towns and resettles their people within Rome, making the city larger again. Defensive works are built, including a major trench and fortifications. A prison is constructed near the heart of civic life, a sign that the growing city now needs institutions of restraint. Across the river, the Janiculum is secured, and a wooden bridge ties it to Rome, extending control beyond the original hills. At the mouth of the Tiber, a harbour is founded, giving Rome a doorway to the sea and the beginnings of a true commercial future. Ancus is remembered as a builder as much as a king. Then the legend introduces a newcomer from Etruria, a man of ambition whose rise reflects Rome's openness to outsiders with talent. He arrives with his wife, a sharp and confident figure who interprets omens as promises of greatness. A dramatic sign is said to occur on the road. A bird lifts his cap and sets it back, a symbolic transfer of royal favour. In Rome, he gains influence through service, skill, and political manoeuvring, and eventually secures the kingship through election and persuasion. As king, he expands Roman power, but he is also remembered for major public works. He begins a grand temple on the Capitol, orders drainage projects to tame the valleys between hills, shapes the central marketplace into an organised civic space, and creates a chariot racing ground that reflects the tastes of Etruscan culture. Rome, in this telling, is becoming a city of stone, ceremony, spectacle, and infrastructure. Conflict emerges between royal authority and religious limits. An augur resists the king's plans to reshape political divisions, and a miracle-like display proves the augur's authority, forcing the king to back down. Yet the king still enlarges the ruling class and expands institutions in his own way, increasing the number of leading families and strengthening the cavalry and the council. In the background, another figure rises, Servius, first introduced through a sign of supernatural protection, with fire appearing around his head without harm. He becomes a favoured servant, then a trusted leader. When the king is murdered by rivals seeking to reclaim power, the palace is sealed, news is controlled, and Servius is placed in command before the public can react. By the time the truth is known, he already holds the state in his hands. His reign is remembered with a different tone. He wins popularity by distributing land and presenting himself as a protector of ordinary citizens. He makes alliances beyond the city, connects Rome to neighbouring communities through shared worship, and expands the urban area by bringing additional hills into the protected zone. A massive defensive system is attributed to him, encircling the city with earthworks that will echo through later history. Servius also reshapes how Rome is organised. The city is divided into districts, the surrounding territory into regional units, and political participation is restructured around property and military obligation. The population is arranged into classes based on wealth, and voting power is tied to those divisions. Under this system, the poorest are not excluded entirely, but their influence is limited. The arrangement favours those who can equip themselves for war and bear the heavier burdens of service. The result is a political machine that rewards property with authority, while presenting itself as a rational structure for defence and order. In the legend, this becomes one of the turning points, where Rome begins to look less like a small settlement and more like a state with a complex civic design. But even a popular king cannot escape palace intrigue. Servius has daughters, and marriages are arranged to calm dangerous ambitions. Instead, the unions become fuel for conspiracy. A ruthless son of the previous royal line and an equally ruthless daughter of Servius form an alliance of desire and violence. Nobles who resent Servius for favouring the common people join the plot. The coup is staged openly. The challenger seizes the throne, claims legitimacy, and when Servius confronts him, he is thrown down the steps and murdered in the street. The daughter drives through the city in triumph and, in the story's most chilling image, refuses to avoid her father's corpse, staining herself in blood as if the narrative wants to mark the moment as a point of no return. The final king of this sequence is remembered as a tyrant. His rule begins in violence and continues through fear. He uses force against rivals, manipulates alliances among Latin towns, and eliminates opposition through staged accusations. He also pursues conquest and control by cunning rather than open war alone. One city resists him, so his son infiltrates it by pretending to flee his father's anger. Welcomed as a victim, he slowly rises inside the city by proving himself in battle and leadership. When he needs guidance, he sends a messenger back to the king. The king responds without words. Walking through a garden, he strikes down the tallest plants one by one. The meaning is understood. Remove the leading men. The son then destroys the city's leadership through false charges and arranged deaths, and the city falls without a final siege. The last Roman king, in the traditional narrative, is remembered not only for fear and violence, but also for finishing projects that reshaped the city's skyline. The great sanctuary on the Capitoline Hill, begun earlier, is said to have been completed under his rule. Building it required clearing older sacred spaces linked to neighbouring peoples who had become part of Rome's story. Some shrines were moved, yet 2 cult sites were said to resist removal. Rather than forcing them away, the builders enclosed them within the new complex, turning what could have been a sign of conflict into a symbol of permanence. During the digging, workers reportedly uncovered a human head in the soil. In the language of ancient Omen, such an image could only be read one way. Rome was destined to become the head, the commanding place, and its power would not simply fade with time. The same tradition presents the temple's dedication as a statement of identity, linking Rome to a triad of major deities, honoured in the wider region and placing them at the centre of the city's public life. Another story places mysterious prophecy at the heart of the monarchy. A foreign woman arrives with a set of books said to contain dire warnings and guidance for the future. The king refuses the price. She destroys part of the collection and demands the same payment for what remains. He refuses again. She burns more, returns with only a few, and still asks for the original sum. At that point, the stubbornness no longer feels like bargaining, but like a test. The king seeks religious advice and buys the books. They are then stored beneath the Capitoline area and guarded by officials whose duty is to consult them in moments of crisis. Whether or not this tale reflects a real event, it expresses something important about Roman thinking. The city imagined itself as guided by signs, threatened by hidden dangers, and dependent on ritual knowledge that could be unlocked only at critical moments. The same atmosphere surrounds another omen. A serpent appears at an altar connected with the royal household and consumes what was offered there. The event is treated as a warning that cannot be ignored. The king sends messengers to consult a famous oracle abroad. 2 princes go, accompanied by a relative known for playing the fool. His dullness is not natural, the story says, but a mask worn for survival under a dangerous regime. Even his gift reflects the strategy. On the outside it looks plain and worthless, but inside it hides real value. The narrative uses this contrast to suggest that cleverness in Rome's early memory often appears as restraint, silence, and patience rather than open brilliance. After the main inquiry, the young men ask a private question that reveals their ambition. Who will rule in Rome? The answer they receive is framed as a riddle tied to family and fate. Whoever kisses his mother first will win the prize. The princes treat it as a literal contest. The cousin interprets it differently. Leaving the sanctuary, he stumbles and presses his lips to the ground, treating the earth as the universal mother. The scene paints him as the only one capable of seeing beyond appearances, and it plants the idea that the future of Rome belongs not to those who rush for advantage, but to those who understand symbols and timing. The monarchy's collapse, in the legendary account, comes from a private outrage that turns into a public revolution. During a siege away from Rome, the king's sons are feasting with a kinsman. A dispute breaks out over whose wife is most virtuous. The men ride out unexpectedly to test the claim with their own eyes. In the city, they find several wives celebrating in comfort and company. At the kinsman's home, however, they find his wife awake in the night, working with her servants, managing her household with quiet discipline. She is judged the best by their standards, and the men return to the camp. But one of the princes becomes obsessed with her, not because she invited attention, but because her reputation makes possession feel like conquest. The uprising moves quickly. The people are called together and persuaded to strip the royal house of authority. The leader of the revolt rides to the army camp and drives out the king's sons. The king himself rushes back toward Rome, intending to crush the rebellion, but finds the gates closed. The story ends the monarchy with an image of exclusion. The king, once absolute inside the walls, is now shut out by those he ruled. He flees to an Etruscan city for refuge. Rome, in this narrative, passes abruptly from dynastic rule to a new political experiment. Instead of one permanent ruler, the city chooses two leading officials to hold power for a single year. Authority is divided to prevent tyranny. The first pair includes the man who led the revolt and the husband of the dead woman whose story triggered it. But the second man carries a name linked to the old royal house, and the public fears symbolism as much as reality. He is pressured to leave, and another noble takes his place. The new leaders refill the council that had been hollowed out by royal violence, and they establish patterns of shared command. Power is presented publicly through attendants and emblems, yet those emblems now serve magistrates, not kings. The danger does not vanish with exile. Envoys arrive from the banished ruler asking for property. Their real purpose is to open a path for restoration. They find supporters among young aristocrats who resent the new order. The plot reaches into the very household of the revolution's leader. Two of his sons are among the conspirators. When the scheme is exposed, the punishment is severe and designed to teach that loyalty to the state outweighs blood. The father presides over the execution of his own children. The legend turns this into a founding lesson of the Republic. Public duty is placed above private affection, and the new order demands sacrifices that monarchy never asked in the same way. The exiled family's remaining wealth is then distributed to the people, deliberately severing any practical hope of reconciliation. War follows. The banished king seeks allies among neighbouring Etruscan cities and marches against Rome. In the battle that comes, the exiled king's son and the Republican leader charge at one another and kill each other in the same clash. The fighting continues until night, and then an eerie moment appears in the tradition. The enemy army withdraws as if warned by a supernatural voice. Rome buries its fallen leader with honour, and the women of the city mourn him for a long period, because he is credited with avenging the wrong that ended the monarchy. Another crisis of suspicion then enters the story. The surviving leader builds a grand house in a commanding place above the civic centre, and rumour spreads that he aims to rule as a king. To silence fear, he performs a symbolic gesture. He appears before the people with lowered emblems of power and tears down the house, rebuilding it on lower ground. He also passes laws meant to prevent a return of tyranny. One law treats any attempt to seize kingship as a crime against the community. Another allows a citizen condemned by a magistrate to appeal to the full assembly. The narrative uses these steps to show the Republic defining itself through limits and safeguards, trying to make the power of officials answerable to the people. Rome's enemies, however, do not accept the new order quietly. A powerful Etruscan ruler arrives with an army intending to restore the exiled king. He takes a strategic hill near the city and pushes the Romans back toward a wooden bridge that links both banks of the river. In the legend, a small group holds the crossing while others destroy it behind them. One fighter remains until the final moment, then leaps into the river and swims back under enemy missiles. The story celebrates this as the kind of courage Rome admired, a single person delaying an army to save the community. The reward is not wealth, but honor and a small piece of land, as if the city wants its heroes to be remembered as citizen soldiers rather than warlords. The siege tightens, food runs short, and another figure steps forward. A young noble enters the enemy camp, hoping to assassinate the invader. He mistakes a close associate for the ruler and kills the wrong man. Captured and threatened with torture, he refuses to beg. Instead, he places his hand into fire and holds it there, proving that fear of pain will not break him. The enemy leader is impressed and releases him. Only then does the Roman speak openly, not out of weakness, but out of confidence. He claims that many more young nobles have sworn to repeat the attempt until the enemy falls. The story uses this to underline a theme. Rome's strength is not one hero, but a collective will. A peace agreement follows, harsh in its terms, including loss of territory and the handing over of hostages. Even then, the narrative inserts a moral test. Some hostages escape by swimming the river. Rome chooses to return them rather than profit from broken faith. The enemy leader, struck by this combination of courage and honesty, is said to release a favoured hostage and later soften his demands. The exiled king tries again, now relying on the wider Latin alliance. Faced with the possibility of a powerful coalition, Rome appoints an emergency commander for a limited time, a single leader meant to prevent division in crisis. A decisive battle is fought near a lake in the territory of a Latin town. The fighting is described as fierce, personal, and crowded with named champions. The exiled king is wounded and removed from the struggle. His ally fights on, driving the conflict back and forth. A vow is made in desperation to build a temple if victory is granted. Then the story becomes supernatural. Twin horsemen appear, shining and unstoppable, and the enemy line collapses. The same mysterious riders are later said to appear in Rome itself, announcing victory, washing their horses near a sacred place, and vanishing. A temple is built in their honor, and the myth ties military salvation to divine favor, reinforcing the belief that Rome's destiny is protected. After this final defeat, the banished king flees to a Greek ruler for shelter, stripped of his sons and followers. The narrative frames it as the proper end of arrogance and cruelty. Rome is freed from kings and steps into a new political identity. Yet even as these tales were repeated with confidence, later writers admitted something important. These stories cannot be treated as straightforward records. Early written archives were said to have vanished in catastrophe, leaving memory to travel by word of mouth. Oral tradition preserves images and values more reliably than exact details. The legends are filled with dramatic scenes that explain why Romans saw themselves as they did: disciplined, suspicious of tyranny, devoted to law, and willing to sacrifice for the state. Many characters looked less like real individuals and more like symbols. One founder embodies war and civic force. Another embodies religion and ritual order. Later, kings echo the same patterns, as if the tradition is arranging history into a moral sequence, rather than reporting events. A major reason these myths grew is simple human logic. When a people inherit ancient rituals, strange customs, and monuments whose original meanings fade, they begin to invent stories that explain them. A wedding ceremony might contain gestures that hint at older forms of marriage by seizure or symbolic violence, and the mind turns that trace into a founding story about abducted brides. A sacred boundary around a city becomes a tale about a brother killed for mocking the wall. A shrine, a fig tree, a cave, a peculiar festival, or a name carved into the landscape becomes a hook for narrative. Places demand explanations and stories supply them. Another influence is cultural borrowing. Roman tradition did not grow in isolation. The Mediterranean was a shared world of tales, patterns, and motifs, and Roman storytellers could adapt foreign narrative shapes into local memory. Clever stratagems, riddling oracles, and dramatic court scenes often resemble stories told elsewhere. Over time, such borrowed elements were reshaped into Roman form and attached to Roman names until they felt native. If the legends cannot be read as plain fact, they still contain fragments worth attention. Archaeology offers one kind of evidence, revealing where early settlement existed and how the physical city expanded. Later laws and institutions offer another kind, preserving the outline of older social structures even after their original context is lost. Together, these clues suggest that Rome began not as one single unified city from the first day, but as a cluster of communities spread across nearby hills, sometimes cooperating and sometimes competing. Distinct religious practices, duplicated priesthoods, and old rivalries remembered in annual contests hint at an early landscape of divided settlements facing one another across low valleys and marshy ground. At some point, those separate communities fused into a larger urban whole. Later tradition attributes major changes to the age of the later kings. Walls that enclosed a wider circuit, engineering works that drained wetlands, and public spaces that turned scattered villages into a single civic body, with a central marketplace and assembly area, and buildings that represented collective unity. Huge drainage channels made firm ground where water had pooled. A combined forum became the stage for political life and commerce. A royal residence and a sacred hearth symbolized both authority and shared identity. Whatever names are attached to these developments in story, the city clearly grew from small hill settlements into a fortified centre with coordinated public infrastructure. Many of those building styles and engineering solutions resemble the techniques associated with Etruscan cities. That does not require a simple picture of Rome as merely an Etruscan creation, but it suggests strong influence at key moments, perhaps through rulers, craftsmen, alliances, or conquest. In the same period, traditions and external hints point to Etruscan power stretching widely across Italy. It becomes plausible that Rome, at least for a time, stood under strong Etruscan pressure or leadership. The famous tale of an Etruscan king threatening Rome can then be read not only as a heroic siege story, but also as a memory that masks a deeper political reality. In early Rome, the true foundation of society was not the state, but the household. Every family formed a small world of its own, ruled by the authority of a single figure, the pater familias. Within his walls lived not only his wife and children, but also slaves, dependents, and clients who relied on his protection. In strict law, his power was absolute. He controlled property, decided the fate of his children, and held the right to punish members of the household without interference from outside. Yet daily life softened this harsh principle. Custom, reputation, and the opinion of relatives acted as restraints, and the father was expected to act as guardian rather than tyrant. He was also the priest of the family, responsible for honouring ancestors and maintaining the small rituals that linked the living to the dead. When he died, authority passed to his sons or nearest male relatives. while daughters remained under male guardianship throughout their lives. From these families grew wider circles of connection known as clans or houses. Membership was traced through male descent, whether by blood or adoption, and each clan possessed its own traditions and sense of identity. Around the clans gathered clients, men who had once been slaves or outsiders seeking protection. Legally, they were almost the property of their patrons, but in practice they enjoyed a measure of independence in return for loyalty and service. This relationship created a network of obligations that bound society together long before formal citizenship became widespread. Out of these dependents gradually emerged a larger body, the plebeians. Many were former clients who had slowly freed themselves from old ties and claimed the protection of the wider community. Others were merchants, settlers, and inhabitants of conquered towns drawn into Rome's orbit as the city expanded. They lived within the walls but outside the ancient noble houses, forming a population whose numbers and importance increased as Rome's influence spread through central Italy. Above all these groups stood the king, the father of the state. His position combined several roles. He was hereditary chief in the style of a patriarch, high priest of the community, and elected magistrate chosen by the people. Tradition described a careful procedure for selecting him. After a king's death, authority returned temporarily to the Council of Elders, who appointed an interim ruler. Eventually a candidate was proposed, accepted by the assembly, confirmed through religious ceremony, and finally approved by the elders who guarded ancestral rights. This mixture of election and sacred sanction reflected Rome's attempt to balance popular will with religious legitimacy. During his lifetime, the king was supreme. He led armies, judged disputes, called the people to assembly, and consulted the Council of Elders when he wished. All officials acted as his assistants, yet his authority was not meant to be lawless. It was limited by custom and by the expectation that he would respect the traditions handed down by earlier generations. When rulers ignored those unwritten limits, they risked losing the loyalty on which their power depended. The Council of Elders, later known as the Senate, represented the leading families. In origin, it may have been a gathering of clan chiefs who retained echoes of their earlier independence. Under the monarchy, it became an advisory body whose influence depended on the personality of the king. After the fall of the kings, its importance grew, for continuity and experience now rested with this permanent council, rather than with annually changing magistrates. Alongside these institutions existed the earliest assembly of the people, organized by curies. Participation was linked to religious and social groupings, rather than wealth or residence. Over time, this body lost significance as new forms of organization appeared, especially the assembly arranged by military units. This later structure grouped citizens according to property and service, favoring those who could equip themselves for war. Voting power followed military responsibility, so the wealthier classes carried greater weight. The system gave the appearance of broad participation, while keeping decisive influence in the hands of those who bore the heaviest burdens of defense. Local divisions known as tribes were also created to manage recruitment and taxation. Originally practical districts, they later became political units through which citizens expressed their will. These arrangements show how Rome's institutions grew, not from abstract theory but from the needs of soldiers, farmers, and administrators. With the overthrow of the monarchy, Rome replaced the single ruler with two annually elected consuls. The change preserved the idea of supreme authority while dividing it to prevent abuse. Each consul held full power, yet could block the actions of his colleague. Their term was limited to 1 year, and after leaving office they could be held responsible for their conduct. Some royal prerogatives were reduced. citizens gained the right to appeal against capital sentences, and religious appointments passed out of the hands of magistrates. The city also distinguished between civil authority within the walls and absolute command in the field, recognizing that different rules were needed in peace and war. In emergencies, however, Rome returned to the old principle of single command through the dictatorship. For a limited time, one man could wield the full authority once held by kings, free from appeal or interference. This office reveals how deeply the idea of concentrated power remained embedded in Roman thinking, even after the Republic was founded. The Senate, strengthened by continuity, guided policy more and more. Assemblies of the people possessed formal sovereignty, yet proposals reached them through magistrates, and their decisions required senatorial approval. The structure allowed popular participation while ensuring that leadership remained in experienced hands. Tension between the orders soon followed. The plebeians had helped overthrow the monarchy, but the new regime often favoured the old noble families. Economic hardship made matters worse. Continuous wars kept farmers from their fields and many fell into debt. The harsh laws allowed creditors to seize debtors' persons as well as their property, driving some into chains. At the same time, the public lands taken in conquest were treated as the private domain of the aristocracy. Poor citizens were excluded from pastures and allotments that might have saved them from ruin. These grievances led to open confrontation. The plebeians withdrew from the city in protest, threatening to establish a community of their own. The crisis ended with the creation of new officials chosen from among the commons, the tribunes. These men were granted personal inviolability and the right to protect citizens from unjust commands. They could halt the actions of magistrates within the city and speak for the interests of the lower orders. Their power was defensive rather than constructive, but it provided a refuge against oppression and gradually became a tool for political change. The tribunes soon gathered the plebeians into their own assembly organized by tribes. This body began to pass resolutions binding on the commons and eventually gained influence over the whole state. The creation of a parallel structure within Rome's constitution was awkward, yet it allowed the excluded majority to organize without destroying the existing order. Land remained a central issue. Public territory, won by the effort of common soldiers, was monopolized by the wealthy. Agrarian proposals sought to redistribute this domain, not to seize private property. Colonies and allotments were meant to transform landless citizens into independent farmers and soldiers. Though many plans were blocked, a few settlements were established, and parts of the city itself were open to plebeian occupation. Amid these struggles, another problem emerged: the uncertainty of the law. As long as rules remained unwritten and preserved only by patrician priests and magistrates, justice could be twisted to serve class interest. A tribune proposed that the laws be recorded and made public. The Senate resisted for years, fearing the loss of its privileged knowledge. Eventually, compromise prevailed. A special board of 10 men was appointed to draft a code and govern temporarily without the usual checks. The first board produced a set of tables that won general approval. The second, elected to finish the work, turned its authority into tyranny. Stories told of their abuses focused on a dramatic episode involving a young woman claimed as a slave through a corrupt judgment. Her father killed her to save her honor, and the outrage united soldiers and citizens against the rulers. The people withdrew once more, and the old offices were restored. Whatever the truth of these tales, the written laws remained. They did not revolutionize society, but they brought clarity. Ancient customs were expressed in definite language, procedures were fixed, and citizens gained protection from arbitrary interpretation. The code preserved stern family authority and severe debt penalties. Yet it also introduced alternatives that suited plebeian life, such as simpler forms of marriage and wills. It confirmed the right of appeal and declared that no citizen could be punished without the judgment of the whole community. Even the latest decision of the people was to override earlier rules, acknowledging that law must evolve. The reforms that followed the fall of the decemvirs did not create an entirely new order, yet they restored and strengthened freedoms that had been pushed aside during the years of emergency rule. The measures later remembered under the names of Valerius and Horatius were less a revolution than a firm declaration that the old rights of Roman citizens still stood. The first of these acts confirmed once more that no Roman could be punished without the chance to appeal to the people. It went further than earlier traditions by forbidding the creation of any office whose decisions would be beyond such appeal. And it threatened death for anyone who attempted to set up such unchecked authority. The second law renewed the sacred protection of the tribunes and of those who served with them, declaring that any man who laid hands upon these officers would be cursed before gods and men. The oath that the common people had once sworn among themselves was now replaced by a public statute, backed by the whole state. The third measure was the most significant for the future. It declared that decisions made by the citizens when gathered in their local divisions should possess the force of law. This principle slowly transformed the political landscape. Over time, the assembly of tribes ceased to be a meeting of plebeians alone and became a gathering of the entire Roman people, presided over by the regular magistrates of the Republic. In that body, the officials who managed the treasury were elected, and it gradually assumed the right to pass binding legislation. The tribunes, once merely defenders of individuals, gained a recognized place beside the Senate. Though they were not yet permitted to sit among the senators, they could attend debates and, in time, obstruct decrees they considered harmful. An attempt to weaken their office had ended instead by making it one of the central powers of the state. These victories encouraged new ambitions. Earlier generations of commoners had fought chiefly for safety and dignity, seeking protection from harsh magistrates and from the uncertainties of unwritten custom. Now, a rising group of wealthy and educated plebeians aimed at equality with the old noble families. They wanted not only fair treatment but access to the honours and commands of the Republic. Their goals differed from those of the poorer farmers, yet for a time both groups marched together against the patrician monopoly. One of the strongest barriers between the orders was the ban on marriage across class lines. The law treated children of such unions as plebeians, denying them the rank of their fathers. When this prohibition was finally lifted, the wall of caste began to crumble. Blood could now pass from one order to the other, and the claim that only certain families were fit to deal with the gods lost much of its force. Social change prepared the ground for political change. The patricians tried to defend the consulship, the highest magistracy, as their exclusive possession. Unable to resist openly, they accepted a compromise. In some years, consuls would be chosen as before, but in others, a board of military tribunes with consular power might govern. Plebeians were legally eligible for this new office, though in practice the nobles used every device to keep it in their own hands. Religious objections, manipulation of elections, and the power to refuse certain candidates allowed them to maintain control for decades. Yet the door had been opened, and in time, plebeians began to pass through it. Another maneuver created the censorship, an office charged with enrolling citizens, assessing property, and overseeing public morals. Though at first modest in scope, it carried great dignity and influence. By separating these duties from the consulship, the nobles hoped to preserve a sphere of authority beyond plebeian reach. Similar tactics were used when the management of the treasury was expanded, but the commons insisted that they too should be eligible, and before long, plebeians were regularly elected as financial officers. Political struggle was accompanied by darker episodes. During a severe famine, a wealthy knight named Spurius Maelius bought grain and sold it cheaply to the hungry. His popularity alarmed the governing class, who accused him of plotting to make himself king. A young patrician acting without trial struck him down in the forum. The house of the dead man was destroyed, and his accusers justified the killing as an act of patriotism. Whether Maelius dreamed of power or merely wished to relieve suffering can no longer be known. Yet his fate showed how deeply fear and suspicion divided the city. While Rome argued within, it fought continually without. For many years, the Republic struggled to hold its borders against the mountain peoples who pressed down from the Apennines. The Aequians, once bold enough to threaten the very walls, were slowly pushed back as Roman colonies secured the approaches to the Hernican Valley. The Volscians, attacked from the rear by new Samnite settlers, lost the towns they had seized in earlier generations. Each gain was small, yet together they changed the balance of power in central Italy. To the north lay a more formidable rival, the Etruscan city of Veii. Equal in size to Rome and proud of its ancient temples, Veii had long contested control of the lower Tiber. The wider Etruscan world was already in decline. Greek fleets dominated the Western Sea. Samnite warriors had seized the rich cities of Campania, and beyond the mountains a new terror appeared, the Gauls moving south into the Po Valley. Isolated from their kinsmen, the Veientines could rely only on a few neighbouring towns. The war that followed lasted many seasons. Roman armies were forced to remain in the field through winter, and for the first time the state paid its soldiers a regular wage. The struggle was bitter and uncertain. Allied forces from Capena and Falerii broke through the Roman lines, and two commanders suffered defeat in open battle. Panic spread even within Rome, and a dictator was appointed to restore order. Gradually the Romans tightened their grip, surrounding Veii and cutting off its supplies. At last, the great city fell. The victors carried off immense booty, and a chosen band brought the revered image of the goddess Juno to a new temple on the Aventine hill. The neighbouring towns soon submitted, and Roman power advanced to the Ciminian heights. Yet triumph bred new discord at home. Many citizens wished to abandon the crowded capital and resettle in the conquered city. Others feared that dividing the people between two centres would destroy the state. After fierce debate, the proposal was rejected, but land from the Veientine territory was distributed to the poorer citizens, easing some of their burdens. The hero of the war, Marcus Furius Camillus, did not escape controversy. He demanded that the soldiers set aside a portion of their plunder for the gods, and this unpopular demand weakened his standing. Accused of taking spoils for himself, he left the city in bitterness, praying that Rome might one day feel the loss of his guidance. His departure seemed to open the door to disaster. That disaster arrived in the form of a wandering Celtic host. These tall warriors, fierce in battle and careless of settled life, had already overrun the northern plain and shattered the last Etruscan strongholds. Moving south in search of plunder, they met a Roman army by the small stream called the Allia. The Roman line collapsed before the wild charge, and survivors fled in confusion toward Veii, or back to the city. Rome itself was left almost defenceless. The invaders entered through open gates and found only the capital guarded. Fires consumed the lower quarters, and the treasures of generations were carried away. For months the citadel held out, while bands of Gauls ravaged the countryside. Hunger finally forced the defenders to bargain for ransom. Gold was weighed out in the forum, and the conquerors mocked the defeated with their heavy swords laid upon the scales. Later stories would claim that a returning hero saved the city at the last moment. But the truth was simpler and harsher. Rome paid to survive. The collapse of Rome before the Gauls had been dramatic, yet it left surprisingly little trace on the long course of Roman power. The invaders vanished as swiftly as they had appeared, and the city, still scarred by fire, resumed its steady expansion on both banks of the Tiber. For a moment, there were voices urging abandonment of the ruined capital and migration to the empty streets of Veii. According to tradition, the debate ended not with grand speeches, but with a simple soldier's remark. A centurion planting his standard and declaring that this was the place to remain. The phrase was taken as an omen, and Rome chose to rebuild rather than flee. The reconstruction was hurried and disorderly. Narrow lanes twisted between new houses, and the irregular pattern of the later city preserved the memory of that frantic effort. Yet the Romans were careful not to loosen their grip on the lands they had conquered. Old strongholds such as Sutrium and Nepete were secured with new settlers, and 4 additional tribes were created in the territories taken from Veii and its neighbours. Southern Etruria was gradually tied to Rome through shared interests and new communities loyal to the capital. While attention turned for decades toward the pacification of Latium, the northern frontier remained uneasy. Only after the Latin question was settled did Roman armies again face the Etruscans. Tarquini, supported by Caia and Falerii, attempted one last resistance. The conflict took on a savage religious tone. Etruscan priests sacrificed Roman prisoners on their altars, and Roman vengeance was equally brutal when victory came. By the middle of the century, the proud cities of the north were reduced to submission. Falerii accepted perpetual alliance, while Caia lost its political independence and became a dependent community governed by Roman officials. The Etruscan world south of the Ciminian forest had effectively fallen under Roman control. Yet the shadow of the Gauls never entirely disappeared. Bands of Celtic warriors continued to drift across the Apennines in search of plunder. Some campaigns were little more than raids, others grew into serious threats. Roman tradition loved to dress these encounters in heroic colours, telling of duels between champions. One tale described the young Titus Manlius facing a towering Gaul on the banks of the Anio, striking him down and taking the golden collar that gave his family the name Torquatus. Another spoke of Marcus Valerius, aided by a mysterious raven that pecked at his opponent's eyes, earning the title Corvus. Whether true or embellished, such stories revealed how deeply the fear of the northern barbarians had sunk into Roman memory. By the middle of the 4th century, the real challenge no longer came from Etruscans or Gauls, but from the rugged peoples of the southern mountains. The Samnites, tough herdsmen from the highlands around Mount Matese, had begun to pour down into the rich plains of Campania. Earlier waves of these warriors had already seized Capua and driven the Greeks from Cumae, while others moved farther south to form the Lucanian people. But the settlers in the plains slowly adopted the habits of the towns they conquered, and their discipline softened amid wealth and comfort. The older Samnite tribes, still living the hard life of the hills, looked with contempt on their kinsmen below. When the Sidicini of Teanum were attacked by the mountain clans, Capua attempted to defend them and suffered a crushing defeat. In desperation, the Campanians appealed to Rome for protection. The request brought Roman legions to the south and opened a new chapter of Italian history. The Samnites refused to accept Roman authority in Campania, and war followed. The fighting was inconclusive, yet it marked the first direct collision between the two rising powers of the peninsula. The conflict exposed tensions within Rome itself. Soldiers quartered in Capua plotted to seize the wealthy city for their own, and unrest spread among debt-burdened citizens at home. Only concessions and new laws restored order. These internal troubles encouraged the Latins and Campanians to dream of a broader union that would stand equal with Rome. They demanded shared magistracies and half the seats in the Senate, a proposal the Roman nobility rejected with outrage. The resulting Latin war was as bitter as any civil conflict. Armies that had once fought side by side now faced each other with identical weapons and tactics. Roman commanders imposed iron discipline. The story of the consul Manlius executing his own son for disobedience became a symbol of stern patriotism. The decisive battle near Vesuvius ended with the self-sacrifice of the consul Decius Mus, who devoted himself to the gods of death and charged alone into the enemy ranks. Victory broke the Latin resistance, and a second defeat at Trifonum completed the collapse. Rome used triumph with calculated restraint. The old Latin League was dissolved, and each city was bound to Rome by a separate treaty. Local self-government remained, but foreign policy lay entirely in Roman hands. The ancient rights that allowed Latins to marry and trade freely among themselves were now confined to relations with Rome alone. Colonies were planted at strategic points, and the great Appian Road linked the capital with Capua, carrying armies, merchants, and new settlers across the peninsula. In Campania, the leading aristocrats who had supported Rome were rewarded, while rebellious towns lost walls or territory. Some communities received partial citizenship. Others became full Roman colonies. Step by step, a new political landscape emerged. A network of allies and dependents, connected not to one another but directly to the ruling city on the Tiber. The rise of Roman power in Latium and Campania did not escape the attention of the Samnites. They watched the expansion with unease, yet their hands were tied by troubles in the south. In Lower Italy, the wealthy Greek city of Tarentum had long feared the pressure of Samnite and Lucanian warriors, and in desperation the Tarentines began to call for help from the Greek homeland. Mercenary commanders crossed the sea one after another. The Spartan king Archidamus was the first to answer the call. But he fell in battle against the Lucanians in 338 BC. His place was soon taken by a far more capable leader, Alexander of Epirus, known as Alexander the Molossian, an uncle of the Macedonian conqueror, who would later shake the world. Alexander arrived with a mixed army of Epirotes, Italian Greeks, and even Lucanian exiles. His campaign was swift and dramatic. He captured Consentia, the chief Lucanian city, and defeated the combined forces of the Samnites and Lucanians near Paestum. Within a short time he controlled the southern peninsula from one coast to the other. Rome, which had recently relied on Samnite friendship during the Latin War, now feared their growing strength and turned instead to Alexander as an ally. The Epirot prince dreamed of founding a Western Greek empire, a vision that even Pyrrhus would later fail to achieve. Yet his sudden success frightened the very people who had invited him. The Tarentines wanted a hired sword, not a master, and they withdrew their support. Alexander tried to create a new alliance among the reluctant Greek cities and the Oscan tribes, but the attempt collapsed. A Lucanian exile assassinated him, and with his death the Greeks of Italy were left to face their enemies alone. The Samnites were once again free to concentrate all their strength on Rome. By this time, Roman authority stretched across Latium and Campania as far as the Volturnus River. Only the Greek twin towns of Palaeopolis and Neapolis remained outside Roman control. A quarrel between the Greeks of Palaeopolis and Roman settlers in Campania gave the Samnites their opportunity. They sent a strong garrison into the city, defying Roman demands for its withdrawal. Both sides believed justice and the gods were on their side, and war became inevitable. What followed was not a minor border conflict, but a struggle to decide whether Italy would be shaped by Latin or Oscan power. Rome moved with careful diplomacy. The Apulian communities, long harassed by Samnite raids, welcomed Roman protection and offered their lands as a base of operations. In Lucania, the nobles feared Samnite dominance and preferred Roman friendship, preventing a wider Oscan coalition. Publilius Philo, one of Rome's most capable statesmen, pressed the siege of Palaeopolis with unusual authority. Eventually, the pro-Roman party opened the gates, and the Samnite garrison fled. The Greeks were treated generously and bound to Rome by equal alliance. Other Campanian towns soon followed their example. The war produced two towering Roman figures, Lucius Papirius Cursor and Quintus Fabius Rullianus. Papirius was a stern traditionalist who valued discipline above all. When Fabius disobeyed his orders and fought a battle in his absence, Papirius threatened him with death despite the victory. Only the intervention of the army and the people saved Fabius, a dramatic episode that revealed the tension between authority and ambition in Roman command. Yet triumph soon turned to humiliation. In 321 BC, the consuls Veturius and Postumius were lured into the narrow valley of Cordium by false reports that the Samnites were far away. The Roman army marched straight into a trap. The exits were blocked, the surrounding hills filled with enemies, and escape was impossible. The Samnite commander, Gavius Pontius, offered terms rather than slaughter. The Romans were to withdraw from disputed territories and dismantle key fortresses. The consuls accepted, and the entire army passed beneath the yoke, surrendering arms and honor in exchange for life. Rome refused to accept the treaty. Claiming the consuls had exceeded their powers, the Senate repudiated the agreement and handed the officers over to the Samnites in chains. Pontius rejected the gesture with dignity, insisting that either the treaty be honoured or the army return to captivity. War resumed, and for several years fortune favoured the Samnites. Roman strongholds fell, Campanian towns wavered, and only stubborn resistance prevented disaster. Gradually, Rome recovered. New colonies secured the roads, and the Great Appian Way tied Campania firmly to the capital. In the north, conflict with the Etruscans revealed the genius of Fabius Maximus, who dared to cross the dreaded Ciminian forest and shatter the illusion of Etruscan power. Victories at Sutrium, Lake Vadimo, and Perusia forced the proud cities of Etruria to seek peace. Still, the Samnites fought on. Their general Gellius Egnatius forged a bold plan to unite Samnites, Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls against Rome. The coalition nearly succeeded, but at Sentinum in 295 BC, the Roman legions met the allied host in a battle that decided Italy's fate. The Roman consul Decius Mus devoted himself to death in a sacred ritual, and the courage of the troops broke the enemy line. Egnatius fell fighting at the camp gate, and the Grand Alliance collapsed. After Sentinum, only the Samnites continued the struggle. Campaign after campaign ravaged their mountains. At Aquilonia, the sacred Samnite band was destroyed, and one by one, their cities surrendered. The final resistance was led by the old hero Pontius, but he was defeated, captured, and executed in a Roman triumph, a grim act that stained the victory. By 290 BC, the war was over. Rome moved quickly to secure the conquered land. Colonies rose at Venusia, Minturnae, and Sinuessa, guarding the roads and the coasts. The Sabines were incorporated, and the Adriatic shore was dotted with Roman settlements. Samnium was surrounded by fortresses, cut off from allies and forced into reluctant peace. The defeat of the Samnites did not bring the calm many Italians expected. In the final years of the long struggle, the Lucanians had been useful to Rome because their pressure distracted Tarentum. Now, they believed the moment had come to profit. Their leaders looked south toward the wealthy Greek cities of the coast, convinced that the victors in Italy were too busy to stop them. A Lucanian commander named Sthenius Statilius moved against Thurii and tightened a siege around the city. Thurii, seeing no other rescue, chose a hard option. It appealed directly to Rome and offered submission in exchange for protection. Rome's response showed how quickly alliances could lose their value. Once Samnium had been subdued and the fortress colony at Venusia secured the region, Roman policy no longer depended on Lucanian cooperation. Roman envoys ordered Statilius to abandon the attack. The Lucanians answered with defiance. They intensified the siege and called on communities across the south to join them in resisting what they presented as Rome's expanding demands. For Thurii, the choice was stark: surrender to nearby raiders, or accept the authority of a distant rising power that now had the strength to enforce its will. Yet Rome could not focus all its attention on the south. Far more urgent danger was forming in the north. Since the decisive battle at Sentinum, the Etruscans and the Gallic tribes had mostly avoided open war. But the new crisis in the south encouraged restless factions to gamble again. Etruscan dissidents raised forces that included large numbers of Senonian warriors, hired for pay. Their target was Arretium, a community loyal to Rome. When Rome rushed troops to lift the siege, the relief force was destroyed. A diplomatic mission followed, sent to protest that Gallic fighters had served Rome's enemies, and to demand the release of Roman prisoners. The attempt at negotiation ended in blood. A Gallic leader named Britomachus killed the envoys, claiming vengeance for his father's death in an earlier conflict. In Roman eyes, this was not only murder, but sacrilege, and it triggered an answer meant to terrify the entire northern frontier. The Roman consul, Publius Cornelius Dolabella, struck directly into Senonian territory, while many of their strongest warriors were still campaigning elsewhere. The response was systematic and brutal. Settlements were destroyed, fighters were slaughtered without mercy, and families were carried away into slavery. The Senones ceased to exist as an independent people in the Italian landscape. Nearby, the Boii reacted with a mixture of fury and fear. They marched south across the Apennines and drew support from Etruscan communities and other Gallic bands. Their combined host advanced toward the Tiber. Dolabella met them near Lake Vadimo as they attempted to cross, and the coalition was shattered. Another defeat followed not long after, and the Boii chose to make peace on their own. Rome then planted a new strongpoint on the Adriatic coast, settling citizens at Saena Gallica, designed both as a barrier against future Gallic movement and as a base for naval reach along the eastern shore. With the north suddenly secured, Rome turned back to the south and moved from defence to offence. Until this point, Roman forces had mainly protected Thurii. Now, the consul Gaius Fabricius confronted the Lucanians in open fighting, broke the siege, and captured Statilius. One by one, nearby Greek cities accepted Roman garrisons. Not always because they loved Rome, but because the alternative looked worse. Croton, Locri, and Rhegium followed the path Thurii had chosen. The result was a tightening ring around Tarentum. Roman influence pressed in from land, and new coastal settlements and naval positions began to threaten Tarentum's control of the sea routes it had long treated as its own. Tarentum had not formally declared war, but suspicion grew that it had encouraged resistance behind the scenes, while avoiding the risks of direct fighting. Then, a Roman squadron appeared in Tarentum's harbour, 10 warships entering waters the Tarentines believed were protected by treaty. Whether the Roman commander intended only a stop on a longer voyage or hoped to strengthen pro-Roman elites inside the city, the move was provocative. Tarentum's public mood snapped. In the theatre overlooking the harbour, a crowd watched the ships approach and listened to speakers who demanded immediate retaliation. The Tarentine fleet rushed out in haste, attacked, and drove the Romans off. Ships were sunk and captured, the Roman commander was killed, and prisoners were executed or sold. At that moment, the city crossed a line that could not be easily uncrossed. Tarentum's democratic faction, which had watched the Samnites bleed for years without committing fully, had been pulled into war by anger and pride. They moved fast to exploit their first success. Tarentine forces marched to Thurii, expelled the Roman garrison, and punished leading citizens who had favoured Roman protection. Property was confiscated, opponents were exiled, and the city was pushed back under Tarentine control. Rome answered with restraint that was as calculated as it was unusual. Roman leaders feared one outcome above all, that Tarentum would call on Pyrrhus of Epirus, a king known for ambition and battlefield skill. So instead of sending an army immediately, Rome sent an embassy demanding satisfaction. The demands were not extreme: release of captives, punishment or surrender of the agitators who had driven the attack, and reversal of the changes imposed on Thurii. The Roman goal was clear. If friendly factions could be installed in the Greek cities, influence could be secured without a costly siege of Tarentum, which Rome was not yet confident it could take by force. The Tarentine crowd did not behave like a government seeking compromise. When the envoys entered the theatre, their accents and formal dress became objects of mockery. The Roman spokesman delivered his message calmly, enduring insults that grew worse as the crowd fed on its own disorder. One incident, whether fully accurate or shaped by later retelling, captured the deeper reality. Public humiliation replaced diplomacy. The embassy returned without agreement, and the Roman Senate still hesitated, aware that Tarentum's walls were strong and its fleet made blockade difficult. The city could not be easily starved or stormed, and a prolonged attempt might only invite the very foreign king Rome hoped to keep away. Even so, Rome could not accept open defiance without response. The consul, Lucius Aemilius Barbula, entered Tarentine territory, devastated farmland, and tried to separate the city's factions by sparing the estates of aristocrats. Force was applied, but selectively, paired with repeated offers of settlement. For a moment, this strategy seemed to work. While leading Democrats were away seeking outside help, Tarentum's aristocrats gained control and chose a commander who favoured negotiation. But the balance shifted again when envoys returned from Epirus, with Pyrrhus's minister, Cineas, promising aid. The Democratic faction regained dominance, removed the moderate leader and pledged to Pyrrhus money, supplies, and command over Italian recruits. The arrival of Pyrrhus's trusted General Milo with Epirot troops in the citadel sealed the commitment. Tarentum was no longer merely resisting Rome. It had placed itself under the protection and direction of an ambitious foreign king. Pyrrhus himself was no ordinary mercenary. His early life had been shaped by exile, restoration, and the ruthless politics of the Macedonian world after Alexander the Great. Born into the royal house of Epirus, he lost his throne as a child and survived through the protection of stronger patrons. He fought in the wars of the age, spent time as a hostage in Egypt, and returned to rebuild his position with foreign backing. He gained coastal access and fought for influence in Greece, even briefly holding Macedon before being driven out again. For years he searched for a stage large enough for his appetite. The call from Italy offered exactly that: a chance to fight Rome, challenge Carthage, and carve out a Western empire that would echo the legends of earlier conquerors. But the plan had weaknesses. Pyrrhus depended on uncertain allies and divided Greek cities, and he lacked a reliable fleet of his own. Unlike the disciplined, unified core that had carried Macedon across Asia, his coalition would be fragile, and his supply lines would run through communities that argued as much as they fought. Still, he crossed into Italy with a powerful force drawn from Greece: heavy infantry, cavalry, missile troops, and war elephants. The elephants were more than weapons. They were psychological shock, unfamiliar to most Italians, and they would shape the early battles. Pyrrhus discovered quickly that Tarentum's promises were larger than its discipline. Many citizens had imagined a hired champion who would fight while they watched. Pyrrhus demanded manpower, obedience, and sacrifice. He forced reluctant townsmen onto the walls, restricted gatherings, and shut down the public entertainments that symbolized Tarentine leisure. The city became a military base, not a free partner. Money and supplies were pulled into the war effort, mercenaries were hired, and Tarentum's independence began to look like a fiction, maintained only by the presence of Epirot troops. Rome prepared with its usual hard focus. Potential revolt among dependent communities was suppressed. Allied contingents were summoned. Forces were deployed to keep northern trouble in check and to hold key positions in the Greek south. The Samnites and Lucanians were watched, and Venusia served as a central anchor against any uprising in the interior. The Roman consul, Publius Valerius Laevinus, moved to face Pyrrhus before he could unite larger Italian support behind him. The first major confrontation formed near Heraclea, where Pyrrhus took position in a way that forced the Romans into difficult ground. The battle was fierce. Roman infantry attacked repeatedly, pressing against the tight discipline of the phalanx. The contest did not break quickly, and for long stretches it looked as though Roman aggression might tear open the Epirot line. Then the elephants entered the fighting. Roman cavalry, unable to cope with the unfamiliar threat, broke and ran, and its retreat disrupted the infantry. The Roman army fell back across the river in disorder. Pyrrhus had won, but the price was heavy. Experienced officers and veterans lay dead. It was a victory that weakened as much as it encouraged. Even so, the result changed the political map. Many southern peoples, Samnites, Lucanians, Bruttians, moved toward Pyrrhus, and most Greek cities opened their gates to him. Roman influence in the far south wavered, and in some places garrisons behaved like occupiers, rather than protectors, deepening resentment. Yet Rome's central alliance system held. The Latin communities did not abandon Rome, and the backbone of its manpower remained intact. Pyrrhus then tried diplomacy. His minister Cineas was sent to Rome to offer peace on terms that would free Greek cities from Roman control and remove Roman strongholds from the south. Cineas was skilled in persuasion, and for a moment it seemed possible that flattery and negotiation might do what battle could not. But Rome's political instinct hardened instead. A famous old statesman, Appius Claudius, spoke against negotiating while a foreign army stood on Italian soil. The Senate rejected the offer. Cineas returned impressed by Roman discipline and the stature of the governing class, yet with no treaty in hand. Pyrrhus advanced northward, raiding and probing, but found Rome guarded by fresh forces recalled from other fronts and by new levies. He could not force the city and could not afford a slow war of attrition. He withdrew to winter quarters, still hoping that another round of bargaining might succeed. Roman envoys met him again, and the legend of Fabricius's integrity grew from these meetings, depicting Roman leadership as immune to bribery and intimidation. Whether every detail is true or polished by later storytellers, the broader point fits the pattern. Pyrrhus could win battles, but he could not break Rome's political will. The next campaign brought another major clash at Ausculum. Pyrrhus attempted to adjust, mixing Italian allies into his formation. Recognizing that Roman flexibility and close quarters aggression were dangerous. On rough ground, his cavalry and elephants were less effective, and the fighting was inconclusive and brutal. On the following day, he managed to draw the battle onto more open terrain, allowing the phalanx to function at its best. Again, the elephants helped tip the struggle, and the Romans withdrew with heavy losses. Pyrrhus won, but the toll on his army was severe, and another victory like it would leave him without the strength to continue. At this point, Pyrrhus looked beyond Italy to Sicily. Syracuse appealed for help against Carthage, and Pyrrhus saw a new path to glory. His shift in strategy pushed Rome and Carthage into cooperation. The two powers agreed to assist one another, if attacked, and to avoid making separate peace. Roman leaders gained the advantage of Carthaginian naval pressure, while Carthage hoped the war in Italy would keep Pyrrhus from fully turning against them. Pyrrhus secured a pause in fighting through practical gestures and exchanges, and then sailed for Syracuse, leaving Milo to hold Tarentum and placing trusted hands in other positions. In his absence, the war in Italy lost its pace. Rome punished some rebels, struggled against renewed Samnite resistance, and gradually tightened control over Greek cities. Some communities accepted favourable terms, others were taken by force or stratagem. Places that had once welcomed Pyrrhus began to reconsider their choices as the promised liberation turned into hard demands and foreign garrisons. Tarentum remained the central base for Pyrrhus's cause, but even there loyalty was complicated by fear and exhaustion. In Sicily, Pyrrhus at first looked unstoppable. Cities fell, and Carthaginian control shrank toward a few strong positions. Yet the deeper problem remained political. Sustaining a fleet and a long campaign required taxes, manpower, and obedience from Sicilian allies, who were famously divided. They began to resent Pyrrhus's autocratic methods and treated him less like a saviour and more like a new ruler. Although he continued to win battles, the cooperation he needed was draining away. When he saw that his Sicilian support was breaking, he turned back toward Italy, embittered and increasingly isolated. The return journey was costly. Naval and land enemies struck at him. He seized opportunities for money and supplies where he could, and stories spread of sacrilege and plunder that damaged his reputation further. More importantly, the quality of his army was no longer what it had been. Veterans had fallen, and replacements were often unwilling levies or mercenaries with weaker cohesion. Meanwhile, Rome prepared for a final decision. The decisive battle came near Beneventum. Pyrrhus attempted a night attack and sought to overwhelm Roman positions before reinforcements could unite. Confusion undermined the effort. Units lost their way, attacks arrived piecemeal, and the terrain reduced the effectiveness of phalanx tactics and cavalry movement. Roman troops met the elephants with fire and panic weapons, and the beasts, frightened, turned back through Pyrrhus's own lines, spreading chaos. The battle went against him. Afterward, Pyrrhus tried to summon help from other kings, but the wider Hellenistic world had little interest in rescuing a fading adventure. He withdrew from Italy and returned to Epirus, still chasing crowns and campaigns until he finally died in a street fight in Greece, struck down during an urban skirmish. Tarentum could not stand alone. Milo held the citadel as long as Pyrrhus lived, but once the king was gone, he sought only a safe exit for his troops. Rome approached the city with an army, while a Carthaginian fleet appeared offshore. Both powers wanted the prize. Milo chose to negotiate with Rome and surrendered the citadel in exchange for free departure. Tarentum lost its fleet and military independence. It kept limited local administration, but its age as a major power was finished. The remaining resistance across southern Italy collapsed in stages. Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians submitted, though bands of fighters lingered in rugged regions for years. One grim episode stood out. A mutinous garrison seized Rhegium and committed atrocities, including attacks on neighbouring communities and violence against Roman forces. Rome and its allies eventually stormed the town and executed the surviving defenders, restoring the city to its earlier population and allowing it to govern itself under Roman oversight. By the end of these campaigns, Rome's dominance stretched across the peninsula, from the far south up toward the central and northern frontiers, binding Italy into a single system of power. The final struggles had not only removed local rivals, but revealed a pattern that would shape the future. Armies could defeat Rome in battle, but breaking its alliances and political endurance was far harder. With Italy secured, the next confrontation was already taking shape across the sea, where the great naval power of Carthage stood as the only rival strong enough to challenge Rome's rise. The victory at Beneventum and the final submission of the rebellious Italian tribes marked more than the end of a long internal struggle. It signalled the moment when Rome stepped out of the familiar world of the peninsula and into the wider arena of Mediterranean power politics. A state that had once fought for survival along the Tiber now stood, recognised as a force capable of shaping the destiny of distant lands. Foreign courts began to take notice. Egypt acknowledged the new reality, and events at Tarentum revealed that confrontation with Carthage was no longer a question of if, but when. Looking back over the centuries of growth, Rome's rise appears less like a sudden expansion and more like the slow hardening of a disciplined organism. The city had been forged through conflict, first among its own citizens, later against neighbouring peoples. Its character was neither brilliant nor imaginative, but steady, legal-minded and stubbornly patient. Order and duty were valued above inspiration. The ruling class, still relatively uncorrupted by overseas wealth, guided the state with a mixture of caution and relentless determination. These qualities allowed Roman armies to endure defeats that would have shattered other nations and to return again and again until victory was secured. Yet success carried new dangers. The old policies that had worked within Italy could not simply be exported to the wider world. Ancient states rarely believed in a balance of power. Security meant eliminating rivals altogether. Step by step, Rome drifted toward a policy of annexation, often unwillingly, pushed forward by immediate necessity, the lure of resources and the momentum of conquest. The institutions that had governed a city-state now faced problems on a continental scale. Provinces had to be organised, armies kept in the field for years, finances stretched, and foreign cultures absorbed. Slavery spread, wealth accumulated unevenly, and the traditional rural class that had filled the legions began to shrink. In this period, the outlines of later turmoil can already be seen. Politically, the centre of gravity shifted toward the Senate. Popular assemblies still existed, but religious rules and complex procedures limited their freedom. Magistrates served short terms and were bound by the vetoes of colleagues and tribunes. The Senate, permanent and experienced, gradually became the true government. It directed wars, controlled finance, and shaped diplomacy. Patrician exclusiveness faded as talented plebeians entered high office, creating a broader aristocracy of service. The state appeared stable, yet beneath the surface, economic change and social inequality were gathering force. Rome's control of Italy was unlike any modern empire. There were no neat provinces with identical laws. Instead, a patchwork of communities, each with its own rights and obligations, surrounded the dominant city. Some towns possessed full Roman citizenship. Others held only private legal rights without a vote. Still, others remained formal allies bound by treaty. Colonies planted along roads and coasts served as watchtowers of Roman influence. National leagues were dissolved, and mutual privileges between neighbouring peoples discouraged. The system was deliberately complicated, preventing unified resistance while offering gradual rewards to the loyal. For a time, it worked remarkably well. Allies governed their local affairs, paid no regular taxes to Rome, and shared in the prestige of Roman victories. Only later, when citizenship ceased to expand and military demands grew heavier, would the arrangement reveal its weaknesses. At the heart of Roman power stood the army. In the ancient world, military organization shaped politics, and in Rome the two were inseparable. Service was both duty and honor. Every citizen was liable for years of campaigning, and a record of battles was the first step toward the public office. The early rigid phalanx had slowly evolved into the flexible legion, capable of fighting on rough Italian hills as easily as on open plains. Soldiers were arranged by age and experience rather than wealth, and the manipular formation allowed units to advance, retreat, and support one another with unprecedented freedom. Discipline was harsh but effective, training constant, loyalty built through shared hardship. Yet the system contained seeds of change. As campaigns lengthened and expanded overseas, the burden on small farmers grew unbearable. The property qualification for service dropped, and poorer men filled the ranks. Allied contingents became increasingly important, while the Roman cavalry declined. Commanders were elected annually, often without regard to ability, and political rivalry intruded into military decisions. These flaws would later prove costly when confronted by genius in the enemy camp. On the sea, Rome was far less prepared. Trade had long connected Italian ports with the wider Mediterranean, but naval warfare required skills the Romans did not possess. Carthage, by contrast, was a maritime power to its core. The Phoenician city commanded a network of colonies and trading posts from Spain to Africa, supported by immense wealth and experienced sailors. Her fleets guarded monopolies and enforced treaties that limited Roman movement. As long as Carthage ruled the waves, Italy's long coastline remained vulnerable. The two states could not avoid collision. Sicily lay between them like a bridge and a barrier, a land where Greeks and Phoenicians had struggled for centuries. The spark came from Messana, seized by Italian mercenaries who called themselves the Mamertines. Threatened by the rising power of Syracuse, they appealed first to Carthage and then to Rome. For the Senate, the decision was agonizing. To aid rebels was dishonorable, yet to allow Carthage to dominate the straits seemed intolerable. The people chose intervention, and with that vote, the First Punic War began. Initial Roman successes on land were followed by the realization that victory in Sicily was impossible without control of the sea. A massive building program created a fleet almost overnight. Lacking nautical experience, the Romans relied on innovation, the boarding bridge that turned naval encounters into infantry battles. At Mylae, this device shattered Carthaginian confidence, and for the first time Rome tasted triumph on water. The war spread across Sicily in a brutal rhythm of sieges and counterattacks. Agrigentum fell after a long blockade, but Carthaginian squadrons harassed Italian coasts and rescued threatened towns. Determined to strike at the heart of the enemy, Rome carried the war to Africa. The landing near Clupea promised decisive results, yet strategic hesitation and the recall of half the army squandered the advantage. The Spartan officer Xanthippus reorganized Carthage's forces and crushed the isolated Roman commander Regulus, reminding the world that discipline and leadership could reverse fortune overnight. Disasters at sea followed as storms wrecked fleets painstakingly built. Still, Rome returned again and again, capturing Panormus and renewing pressure on the western fortresses. The Great Siege of Lilybaeum became a test of endurance unmatched in the age. Walls were undermined and rebuilt. Engines burned, sorties launched under moonlight. Carthaginian captains ran the blockade with breathtaking skill, while Roman legions dug trenches that stretched like iron chains around the city. At Drepana, a reckless Roman admiral suffered a humiliating defeat, and another fleet was lost to the waves. For several years the conflict settled into stalemate. Then appeared Hamilcar Barca, a commander of rare vision. From mountain strongholds he waged a war of movement, striking coasts and cutting supply lines, forging an army loyal to his personal authority. The Romans, exhausted and nearly bankrupt, seemed unable to finish the struggle. In the end, national determination prevailed. Wealthy citizens financed one last fleet, lighter and better trained than before. Off the Aegaean islands, it met a hastily prepared Carthaginian armada and destroyed it. With the sea closed and the Sicilian fortresses isolated, Carthage sought terms. Sicily and the surrounding islands passed to Roman control, and a heavy indemnity was imposed. The longest war the Mediterranean had yet seen came to an end. Both powers emerged wounded. Rome had lost tens of thousands of citizens and seen her coinage debased. Yet she gained her first province and the strategic mastery of Italian waters. Carthage, stripped of Sicily and humbled at sea, retained vast resources and an unbroken spirit. The contest had revealed the strengths and weaknesses of each system: Rome's resilience and citizen armies, Carthage's wealth and professional generals. Peace was only a pause. Across the horizon, new storms were already gathering, and the next encounter would determine the fate of the entire Western world. The revolt that shook Carthage after the First Punic War began as a dispute over unpaid wages and ended as a struggle that nearly destroyed the state itself. The veterans who had fought in Sicily were allowed to return in large numbers to the city, still armed and still demanding the rewards they believed had been promised. The government, weakened by debt and divided by faction, attempted to delay payment with empty assurances. What began as discontent hardened into open mutiny. A Campanian deserter named Spendius, a Libyan called Matho, and a fierce Gallic mercenary known as Auctoritus emerged as leaders of the movement, and under their direction the rebellion spread far beyond the original soldiers. The Libyan population, long oppressed by harsh taxes and forced levies, rose in mass support. Entire districts abandoned Carthage, eager to avenge years of confiscations and humiliations. The conflict that followed was among the most brutal of the age. Carthaginian commanders proved hesitant and divided, while the rebels fought with the fury of men who expected no mercy. Only the arrival of Hamilcar Barca, recalled to save his country once more, turned the tide. Through relentless campaigning and calculated terror, he crushed the revolt, leaving the countryside scarred and the memory of the war etched deeply into the Carthaginian mind. Even as this internal storm subsided, another crisis struck. Rome had at first behaved with surprising restraint. Exhausted by its own struggles, it allowed King Hero of Syracuse, to send aid to Carthage and refused appeals from rebel groups in Sardinia and Utica. Yet temptation proved stronger than principle. When the mutineers in Sardinia begged for protection against the native tribes, Roman leaders accepted the invitation and occupied the island, claiming it had become ownerless. Carthaginian protests were answered with threats, and in 238 BC the weakened state was forced to surrender both Sardinia and Corsica, and to pay a heavy indemnity. The act was widely regarded as robbery, and it planted in Hamilcar a bitterness that would shape the next generation. Sicily, meanwhile, was reorganized under Roman control. Hero remained an independent ruler, but the rest of the island was divided into a patchwork of privileges and burdens. A few cities kept their freedom, many paid a tithe of their produce, and large stretches of land were declared public property to be leased by Roman officials. The removal of commercial rights between communities undermined local economies, and wealth flowed toward Roman investors and a handful of favoured Sicilians. Agriculture declined, estates grew larger, and slavery expanded rapidly across the countryside. In Italy itself, military concerns were limited, yet tensions simmered. The Ligurian tribes resisted Roman pressure for years, and Sardinia and Corsica remained restless. Carthaginian agents encouraged disturbances wherever possible. Along the Adriatic coast, Rome completed a chain of colonies, culminating in the foundation of Brundisium, a port that opened the Eastern Sea to Roman influence. Across that sea, piracy flourished. The Illyrian coast, rugged and poorly controlled, became a haven for swift raiding vessels. Greek towns appealed to Rome for protection, and an embassy was sent to Queen Tutor. She replied that she could restrain official attacks, but not the private ventures of her subjects. A Roman envoy answered that Rome would teach Illyria how to govern its people, and soon afterward he was murdered. War followed immediately. Roman fleets crossed the Adriatic, relieved besieged cities, and forced Tutor to accept humiliating terms. For the first time, Rome gained a foothold in Greece and was welcomed by many as a liberator. Attention then turned northward. The fertile plain of the Po was held by Celtic peoples who had long threatened the peninsula. Roman leaders sought the Alps as a natural frontier, and colonies were planted to secure the region. The policy provoked the Gauls, and in 225 BC a massive invasion swept towards central Italy. Panic seized Rome, but the armies of the Republic converged from every direction. Near Telamon, the invaders were trapped between two consular forces and destroyed. The victory opened the way for the conquest of Cisalpine Gaul, the construction of new roads, and the establishment of strong settlements at Cremona and Placentia. While Rome expanded steadily, Carthage searched for a new foundation of power. Hamilcar Barca looked to Spain, a land rich in silver and brave warriors. There, he began to build an empire that might balance the losses in Sicily and Sardinia. Through war and diplomacy, he brought many tribes under control, founded new cities, and created an army loyal to his family rather than to the distant Senate of Carthage. After his death, his son-in-law Hasdrubal continued the work, establishing the splendid harbour of New Carthage and extending Punic authority to the Ebro. The Romans, distracted by their own concerns, limited themselves to a vague agreement that Carthaginian power should not cross that river. The arrangement was fragile, and when Hasdrubal was assassinated, the army chose as its new commander the young Hannibal, a man raised from childhood to hate Rome. He possessed energy, imagination, and an understanding of warfare that no Roman of the age could match. Hannibal's first great act was the siege of Saguntum, a city friendly to Rome but lying within the Punic sphere. The Romans protested, yet no army was sent. After 8 months, the city fell in flames and the road to open conflict was clear. An embassy demanded Hannibal's surrender, but Carthage accepted the challenge of war. Comparing the two powers, Rome seemed stronger. Italy was united, its roads and colonies secure, and its citizen armies numerous. Carthage relied on hired troops and lacked naval dominance. Yet Hannibal's genius and his Spanish veterans compensated for many weaknesses. His plan was bold: to carry the war into Italy itself, gather the discontented Gauls, and strike at Rome before the Republic could mobilize its vast resources. In the spring of 218 BC, he left New Carthage with a great host, crossed the Ebro, forced his way through the Pyrenees, and marched toward the Rhone. Roman commanders, slow to grasp his purpose, failed to block the crossing. By a clever maneuver, he outflanked the Gallic defenders, ferried his troops across the river, and turned toward the mountains. The passage of the Alps became one of the legendary feats of antiquity. Hostile tribes harassed the column, and narrow paths collapsed beneath the weight of men and animals. Snowstorms struck early, and many perished from cold and hunger. At one terrible point, an avalanche destroyed the road, and the soldiers were forced to carve a new way through rock and ice. After 15 days, the shattered army reached the Italian side, reduced to a fraction of its former strength, but still led by a commander whose confidence never wavered. Hannibal's arrival in northern Italy caught Rome unprepared, not only in speed but in imagination. The armies that should have met him were scattered far away, one committed to Spain and another still assembling in Sicily. In the valley of the Po there remained only the battered remnants of earlier forces, units that had struggled unsuccessfully to contain the Gallic unrest. The Senate had assumed that the Alps would delay any invader for months. They did not understand the man who now stood beyond those mountains, or the new character of the army he commanded. Scipio, who had sent his main force west to Spain, relied on Rome to reinforce Italy in time. Orders were sent to recall Sempronius, yet the government hesitated, convinced that the natural barrier of the mountains would hold. Had Scipio landed boldly at Genoa and marched directly on Turin with his full strength, the invasion might have been strangled in its cradle. Instead, he returned from the coast with a modest detachment, crossed the Apennines, gathered the troops already in the north, and prepared to intercept what he believed would be a weary and broken enemy. Within weeks, Hannibal proved how wrong those calculations were. After resting his men and crushing the Taurani to secure his rear, he moved swiftly toward the Insubrian territory. Scipio advanced cautiously along the left bank of the Tichinus, unaware that the Carthaginian army had already recovered its strength. The two commanders met unexpectedly while leading reconnaissance forces. The clash that followed was sharp and decisive. Roman light troops were scattered, their cavalry outflanked by Numidian riders, who struck from the rear. Scipio himself was wounded and carried from the field by his young son, the future conqueror of Africa. The engagement revealed a painful truth. In open country, the Roman horse could not stand against Hannibal's veterans. Realizing his danger, Scipio withdrew toward the Po with remarkable speed. Bridges were broken, camps abandoned, and the army reassembled under the walls of Placentia. There, he chose to wait for his colleague rather than risk another encounter. Hannibal crossed the river upstream, opened negotiations with the local tribes, and settled before the Roman position, eager for a battle that would confirm his influence among the Gauls. The winter of 218 BC brought Sempronius from the south with fresh legions. Ambitious and confident, he interpreted a minor cavalry success as proof that the enemy was vulnerable. Scipio, still recovering from his wound, urged caution, but the younger consul longed for glory before his term expired. Hannibal understood this temper perfectly. He chose the ground and the moment with ruthless care. On a freezing morning near the Trebia, he sent Numidian riders to provoke the Roman camp. Hungry and unprepared, the legions rushed across the icy river in pursuit. On the opposite bank, they faced an army that had eaten, rested, and warmed itself beside great fires. Carthaginian infantry formed a solid centre while cavalry and elephants waited on the wings. Hidden in a ravine behind the field lay a picked force under Mago, ready to strike at the decisive instant. The battle unfolded exactly as Hannibal intended. Roman light troops were swept aside, and their cavalry collapsed under the pressure of superior horsemen. The legions fought with stubborn courage, but they were already outflanked when Mago burst from concealment and struck their rear. Thousands fell beside the river they had crossed so carelessly. Only a single division cut its way through to Placentia. By night, the Roman army had ceased to exist, and northern Italy belonged to Hannibal. Rome responded with grim determination. The Senate turned to Quintus Fabius Maximus, a patrician of severe character and unshakable patience. Elected dictator, he reorganized defenses, strengthened the fleet, and recalled scattered forces. Unlike his predecessors, he refused to gamble the Republic on another pitched battle. His purpose was to wear the invader down, to deny supplies, and to protect the allies whose loyalty formed the backbone of Roman power. Hannibal, meanwhile, left the Po Valley and marched east toward the Adriatic. He needed rest for his men, fresh horses, and above all the support of the Italian peoples. From Picenum, he sent messages to Carthage describing his victories and asking for aid. Yet the hoped-for rising did not come. The Latin communities remained faithful, bound by habit, interest, and fear of Roman retribution. In the spring of 217 BC, the Carthaginian commander turned south through the Apennines. Torrential rains flooded the lowlands, and his army struggled for days through marsh and water. Many animals died, and Hannibal himself lost the sight of an eye to illness. But the march achieved its purpose. He slipped past the Roman position and stood between Flaminius and the road to Rome. The disaster at Lake Trasimene followed. Roman troops, marching in dense column along the narrow shore, were swallowed by mist and ambush. Hills concealed Carthaginian infantry, while cavalry blocked the exits. Within hours, an entire army was destroyed, and Flaminius lay dead among his soldiers. The road to the capital seemed open, yet Hannibal again refused the temptation of a siege and moved toward Apulia, seeking allies rather than walls. Fabius now took command of the main Roman force. He shadowed the enemy from the hills, avoiding every lure to fight. Hannibal ravaged Campania to force a decision, but the dictator merely tightened his watch. At one moment he appeared to have trapped the Carthaginians in the Falernian plain, blocking every exit. Hannibal escaped by a daring ruse, driving cattle with blazing torches toward the heights to draw away the guards while his army slipped through the pass. The campaign tested Roman patience to the limit. Many accused Fabius of cowardice and demanded action. Under political pressure, the Senate elevated his lieutenant Minucius to equal authority, undermining the unity of command. The result was immediate. Minucius, eager for glory, accepted battle on unfavourable ground, and would have been destroyed had Fabius not intervened to rescue him. The episode restored discipline, but deepened the divisions within Rome. As winter approached, Hannibal settled his troops around Geronium on the edge of the Apulian plain. His position allowed access to grain and pasture, yet it also signalled that the war had entered a new phase. The invader hadn't broken the Roman alliance, but neither had Rome found a method to defeat him. Between caution and audacity, the fate of Italy now hung in uncertain balance. The command of the Roman armies in southern Italy passed in the winter of 217 to Marcus Atilius Regulus and Gnaeus Servilius, officers who inherited not only the legions but also the cautious methods established by Fabius. They held the field through the closing months of the campaign and into the following year, waiting for the newly elected consuls to arrive. When the season ended, Hannibal still dominated every mile of country his cavalry had ridden. No Roman force had beaten him in open battle, yet politically he stood almost where he had begun. The confederacy that bound Italy to Rome remained unbroken, and it was clear that a single victory, however brilliant, would not loosen those deep joints of loyalty. To achieve that, a far heavier blow would be required. The reinforcements Hannibal expected from abroad were slow and uncertain. Carthage promised much, but delivered little that was decisive. At Rome, the determination of the Senate hardened rather than weakened. The capital, though surrounded by ruined fields and emptied households, refused even the smallest concession. Offers of assistance from Naples and Paestum were declined with proud restraint, as if to show that Rome would rely on its own strength alone. At the same time, a message was sent to Philip of Macedon, demanding the surrender of Demetrius of Pharos. And Publius Scipio was dispatched to Spain with a fresh expedition to seal the land route by which Carthaginian armies might reach Italy. These gestures revealed a state that, though wounded, had not lost confidence in its destiny. Inside Rome, a fierce political storm was gathering. Many citizens, exhausted by taxes and constant levies, blamed the aristocracy for prolonging the war through the cautious strategy associated with Fabius. The popular faction portrayed the Senate as timid and self-interested, and the mood of the streets began to turn against the established order. From this unrest, a new democratic party gradually emerged, strengthened by the fear and anger produced by years of disaster. When elections were held, the people demanded a leader of their own choosing, a man who would strike boldly rather than delay. In a moment of high emotion, they elevated Gaius Terentius Varro, a true son of the commons, eloquent and energetic but untrained in war, to the consulship. The choice revealed the weaknesses of Roman institutions when confronted by an imperial crisis. Annual elections, divided command, and the intrusion of party rivalry into military decisions produced confusion at the very hour when unity was most needed. Strategy was debated in the forum, rather than planned in the camp, and the authority of experienced officers was undermined by popular enthusiasm. These internal flaws, as much as Hannibal's genius, prepared the way for the catastrophe that followed. Varro's colleague was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a respected soldier whose victories in Illyria had earned him admiration but little affection among the masses. He accepted office reluctantly, aware that he would serve beside a partner determined to seek a decisive battle. Public opinion demanded a dramatic stroke to restore the faith of the Allies and the credit of Rome. The Senate, unable to resist the pressure, placed at the consul's disposal the largest army the Republic had ever assembled. 8 legions of citizens supported by an equal number of Italian troops. More than 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. The order was simple and terrible. Surround Hannibal and destroy him. While this immense force gathered, secondary operations were arranged to distract the enemy. One army was sent toward Gaul, another to Sicily, and a fleet was directed against Africa. Hannibal, meanwhile, had spent the winter at Geronium, holding together his mixed host through careful discipline and personal influence. Supplies were short and pay irregular, yet loyalty to the commander kept the ranks firm. Unable to provoke the proconsuls into action, he remained watchful until May, when he suddenly broke camp and seized the Roman depots at Canna, a move that forced the consuls to confront him on ground of his own choosing. the battle that followed became the most terrible day in Roman memory. The Romans, confident in numbers, crowded their infantry into deep columns, sacrificing flexibility for sheer weight. Hannibal arranged his men with calculated subtlety, pushing forward the Gauls and Spaniards in a curving line while holding the African veterans on the wings. His cavalry, superior in quality, waited for the decisive moment. As the legions pressed forward, they were drawn into a trap, enveloped from both sides, and finally struck in the rear by Hasdrubal's horsemen. The Roman army dissolved into a slaughterhouse. Consuls, senators, and tens of thousands of soldiers lay dead on the plain, and the Republic seemed for a moment on the edge of extinction. Yet even after Cannae, the Confederacy did not collapse. The blow was immense, but the structure of Roman power proved stronger than any single defeat. The Senate, though shaken, rejected negotiation and prepared new armies. Hannibal, master of the field, discovered that political victory was harder than military triumph. Town after town hesitated to abandon Rome, and the promised flood of allies never arrived. In Sicily, events moved with equal drama. The death of the aged king Hiero removed the one statesman who had balanced prudence with independence. His successor, Hieronymus, impulsive and inexperienced, turned toward Carthage and provoked internal revolution. Syracuse became a battlefield of factions, until Roman intervention under Marcellus transformed disorder into open war. After a long siege, famous for the ingenious machines of Archimedes, the city fell and was given over to plunder, marking the end of its ancient freedom. Across the Adriatic, Philip of Macedon entered the conflict, but acted with fatal hesitation. Instead of carrying the war to Italy, he allowed himself to be entangled in Greek rivalries. Rome exploited those divisions, forming alliances that kept the Macedonian king occupied, while the struggle in the west continued. In Spain, the contest was equally uncertain. The brothers Publius and Gnaeus Scipio at first achieved remarkable successes, holding the line of the Ebro and encouraging local tribes to resist Carthage. But their reliance on mercenary auxiliaries proved disastrous. Abandoned by these allies, both commanders were defeated and killed, and the Roman position shrank once more to the northern coast. Only the arrival of new leadership prevented total collapse. Thus, years after Cannae, the war had become a vast and complicated contest stretching from the Alps to Africa. Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy, yet the foundations of Roman power endured. The struggle was no longer a question of single battles, but of endurance, resources, and the stubborn will of a state determined to survive at any cost. The Roman Senate had long understood that the true danger of the war no longer lay only in Italy. Beyond the sea, in Spain, Carthage was rebuilding its strength, preparing new armies, and waiting for the moment to reopen the road to the Alps. To meet that threat, Rome needed more than a capable officer. It required a commander who could combine political insight with military imagination, a figure able to challenge the authority and charisma of the Barcid house on its own ground. The choice fell on Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young survivor of Ticinus and Cannae, son and nephew of the generals who had died in Spain. His name alone carried emotional power, and behind him stood one of the most influential families of the Republic. Yet Scipio was not merely the heir of a tradition. He possessed qualities that set him apart from the older Roman type: an education shaped by Greek culture, a refined manner, and a certain regal confidence that many admired and others distrusted. He spoke of divine guidance, sought solitude before great decisions, and carried himself with a dignity that suggested a man already living in the future. Such traits made him both magnetic and controversial. To supporters, he appeared as the destined saviour of Rome, the only leader capable of matching Hannibal in boldness and intelligence. To opponents, he seemed dangerously independent, impatient with the restraints of republican custom. His victories would later be celebrated as the triumph of genius, yet even in his own time, some sensed that his rise marked a subtle shift toward personal power. The manner of his election reflected these tensions. Officially, the Spanish command was open to volunteers, but the Senate quietly ensured that the popular vote would fall upon Scipio. At barely 25 years of age, holding only minor office, he was entrusted with an army and a war that had already consumed the lives of 2 experienced consuls. With 11,000 men, accompanied by loyal officers such as Gaius Laelius and Junius Silanus, he sailed west, determined to reverse the fortunes of Rome. His first objective was New Carthage, the heart of Punic Spain. The Carthaginian generals were scattered across the peninsula, none closer than 10 days' march from their capital. The city itself guarded the treasury, the arsenals, and the hostages of many Spanish tribes, yet its garrison was small and complacent. Scipio advanced with remarkable secrecy, crossed the Ebro in a single rapid movement, and appeared before the walls before the enemy fully understood his intention. The site favoured daring. The city lay between a deep harbour and a broad lagoon, joined to the mainland by a narrow neck of land. After an initial assault failed, Scipio exploited the fall of the tide, sending columns across the shallow water while a simultaneous attack distracted the defenders from the front. The surprise succeeded. Within hours, the Romans held the streets, and with them immense stores of weapons, money, and ships. Skilled craftsmen were spared to equip the conqueror's own forces, and the hostages were released to win the loyalty of their tribes. The brutality of the sack was tempered by calculated gestures of mercy, including the celebrated return of a noble captive woman to her family, an episode that spread Scipio's reputation across Spain. The fall of New Carthage changed the balance of the war. The Punic armies withdrew toward the older bases in the south, and Scipio spent the following months consolidating alliances. In the next campaign, he sought out Hasdrubal, who was preparing to march for Italy with reinforcements and treasure. The encounter at Baecula ended with a Roman success. Yet, the Carthaginian commander slipped away with his best troops, beginning the long journey that would later bring him to the Metaurus. Scipio had won the field but lost the larger game. For 2 more years, the struggle continued across the valleys of Andalusia. Spanish towns shifted allegiance, revolts flared, and Roman columns advanced by a mixture of persuasion and force. Finally, at Ilipa, Scipio revealed the full measure of his tactical skill. After days of cautious maneuver, he altered the customary order of his army, placing Roman veterans on the wings and Spanish allies in the centre. At dawn, he attacked before the enemy had eaten, extending his line diagonally and striking the weaker flanks with overwhelming strength. The Carthaginian army collapsed, and with it, the Punic Empire in Spain. By 206, the last strongholds had fallen and Gades opened its gates. Scipio returned to Rome, hailed as the architect of victory, though official honours were withheld on technical grounds. His ambitions now turned toward Africa itself. He believed that only by carrying the war to Carthage could Hannibal be forced from Italy and the conflict finally ended. The Senate hesitated. Memories of earlier disasters and the presence of Hannibal in Bruttium bred caution. Scipio received the province of Sicily but was denied full state support for an invasion. Undeterred, he gathered volunteers, refitted ships with private donations, and trained the veterans of Canna into a disciplined expeditionary force. His opponents warned that he was acting like a king, yet popular enthusiasm swept aside resistance. Across the sea, Carthage prepared its defence. Hasdrubal Gisgo raised new armies. Syphax of Numidia was drawn into alliance, and a powerful fleet assembled. Scipio landed near Utica with limited numbers and soon found himself outmatched. For months he lay in a fortified camp, probing for advantage. Then, using negotiations as a screen, he launched a night assault on the enemy encampments, setting the reed huts ablaze and destroying 2 armies before they could form for battle. A second victory on the Great Plains shattered Carthaginian confidence, and the Numidian king was captured by Massinissa, now Rome's crucial ally. Peace seemed within reach. Envoys crossed the sea, and preliminary terms were discussed. But political passions in Carthage ran high. Supplies were seized from a Roman convoy, and violence against ambassadors ended the truce. The war resumed, and Hannibal was recalled from Italy to defend his homeland. The final meeting of the 2 great captains came near Zarma. Hannibal arranged his elephants in front, mercenaries and militia behind, and a reserve of Italian veterans at the rear. Scipio opened lanes in his formation to receive the charge of the beasts, while Massinissa and Laelius held the wings with superior cavalry. When the elephants were driven back in confusion, the infantry lines clashed in a savage contest. The first Carthaginian ranks broke, the second hesitated, and at last the Roman horse returned to strike from behind. The army that had followed Hannibal across half the world perished where it stood. Carthage sued for mercy. The terms imposed were harsh but not annihilating: surrender of the fleet, heavy indemnities, loss of overseas possessions, and subordination of foreign policy to Rome. Hannibal himself urged acceptance, recognizing that further resistance would mean ruin. The victory transformed Italy and the wider Mediterranean. Towns that had wavered were punished. New colonies secured the countryside. Vast tracts of land passed into Roman hands. Yet triumph brought its own burdens. The war had drained the rural population, enriched speculators, and filled the fields with slaves. The old citizen army gave way to professionals, and the gulf between wealth and poverty widened dangerously. Abroad, Rome emerged as the dominant power of the West, protector of allies, and master of new provinces. But the Republic had paid a heavy price. Its institutions, designed for a city-state, were stretched by imperial responsibilities. The challenge ahead was no longer survival, but governance. How to rule distant lands, restrain greed, and preserve the civic virtues that victory had placed at risk. The struggle with Hannibal ended not simply with a battle, but with a transformation. From the ashes of war rose an empire, and with it the question that would haunt Rome for generations: whether power won by endurance could be guided by wisdom rather than by appetite.